high in the Andes, somewhere around 1,000 years ago, give or take a century, two great societies came to an end. Not at the same moment exactly, and not for reasons anyone can point to with real confidence, but close enough in time and close enough in space that historians and archaeologists have spent decades trying to figure out if the two stories are connected at all. One was called Tiwanaku, the other was called Wari, and between them, on a lonely mountain called Cerro Baúl, both of these powers actually sat on the same slope at the same time, for reasons we're still trying to understand. If you're listening to this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. So if you want, subscribe, and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is right now. I read the comments, and it's always something like Tokyo at midnight, Denver at 2 a.m, all stacked up together, all of you drifting off at completely different hours. And if you want an easy way to keep this going every night, following the show on Spotify is honestly the best way to support what I do here. There's a link in the description. It costs nothing, and it helps more than you'd think. Now, about these two empires. Wari controlled a huge swath of the Andean highlands, from what's now Peru, with roads, administrative centres, storage complexes, all the hallmarks of a state built to expand and to rule. Historians generally agree, without much argument, that Wari was an empire in the way we usually use that word. Tiwanaku is different. It sat near the shores of Lake Titicaca. It built enormous stone platforms and gateways that still confuse engineers today, and it clearly had enormous influence across a wide region. But whether it was an empire in the same sense as Wari, with soldiers and conquest and direct rule, or something more like a religious centre that other communities orbited around voluntarily, trading, worshipping, sending pilgrims, that's genuinely contested. Some archaeologists, following a scholar named Alan Kollu, argue Tiwanaku was expansionist and state-like, pushing outward with real political control. Others think it looked more like a hub of shared belief and shared ritual, a place people came to rather than a place that came to them. Nobody has settled this, and we're not going to pretend otherwise tonight. What we do know is that both of these societies rose to remarkable heights on some of the harshest high-altitude land on the planet, and both of them, within a couple of centuries of each other, came apart. The cities emptied. The roads went quiet. The great stone platforms stopped being built. And when you ask archaeologists what caused it, you get several different answers, all reasonably argued, none of them fully proven. Drought shows up in the ice cores. Political fragmentation shows up in the pottery. Some sites look burned, some just look abandoned. Tonight, we're going to walk slowly through this world. We'll look at Tiwanaku rising beside its lake, at the strange stones of Pumapunku, at Wari's planned cities laid out with almost obsessive geometry, and at that mountain, Cerro Baúl, where both powers apparently lived close enough to share a view. We're not going to arrive at a tidy answer, because there isn't one yet. But there's a lot of quiet, careful evidence to sit with, and a long night ahead to sit with it. Before we get to the collapse, it helps to sit for a while in the world these two societies actually lived in, because that world was not gentle, and it shaped almost everything that happened later. The Andes are not like most places humans have built civilizations. This is a mountain range running down the western edge of South America, folding up out of the earth in long parallel ridges, with valleys tucked between them at every possible elevation. Somewhere in the middle of this range, in what is now Bolivia and Peru, sits a high plain called the Altiplano. It is one of the highest inhabited plateaus on the planet, sitting somewhere around 12,000 feet above sea level. At that height, the air holds noticeably less oxygen than it does at sea level. Nights are cold even close to the equator. Frost is a regular visitor, even in what would count as summer elsewhere. The soil is thin, often rocky, and the growing season is short and unpredictable, squeezed between the risk of frost on one side and the risk of drought on the other. And on this Altiplano, near the southern shore of a very large lake, one of these two civilizations took root. The lake is called Titicaca. It sits at the border of modern Bolivia and Peru, and it is enormous, one of the largest high-altitude lakes anywhere in the world. Its water moderates the surrounding climate just slightly, enough to make agriculture a little more forgiving near its shores than it would be a few miles out on the open plain. This mattered. In an environment this harsh, small advantages in climate could mean the difference between a community that could feed itself reliably and one that could not. The people who eventually built Tiwanaku understood this, and much of what they constructed, as we will get into later, was designed specifically to squeeze food out of ground that, left alone, would barely support anything at all. Tiwanaku itself grew up a few miles inland from the lake's edge, though close enough that its economy and its rituals both stayed tied to the water. Most estimates place its rise somewhere in the first few centuries of the first millennium, with its major building phases and its widest influence stretching from roughly 500 AD through to somewhere around 1000 AD, give or take a century in either direction, because dating a civilization this old, this far from written records, is never going to be exact. For several hundred years, this was one of the most important centers in the southern Andes. People came from long distances to be there, whether as pilgrims, traders, labourers, or something closer to subjects, depending on which archaeologist you ask. To the north and west across a stretch of highland terrain that could take weeks to cross on foot. Another civilization was rising on its own separate timeline, though the two overlapped for most of their existence. This one is called Wari, and its heartland sat in what is now the south-central highlands of Peru, near the modern city of Ayacucho. Wari's major growth appears to have started slightly later than Tiwanaku's, picking up around 600 AD, and it expanded aggressively over the following centuries, eventually stretching its influence across a huge portion of the Peruvian highlands and down toward the coast. Roads, administrative outposts, storage facilities, all the physical evidence of a state actively organizing territory, start showing up wherever Wari's reach extended. So here is the picture worth holding on to for the rest of tonight. Two civilizations occupying different stretches of the same mountain range, both flourishing for something like 400 to 500 years, both reaching architectural and organizational heights that still surprise people who study them closely, and both existing at the same time as each other for most of their history. They were not the same culture wearing two names. Their pottery looked different. Their architecture looked different. Their religious imagery, while it shared some symbols, developed along different paths. But they were contemporaries, breathing the same thin air, farming the same difficult slopes, at times close enough geographically that their people almost certainly knew of one another, traded with one another, and in at least one remarkable location appear to have lived within sight of each other for generations. It is worth pausing here on just how physically demanding this setting was for both of them. High altitude does more than make breathing harder. It shortens growing seasons. It limits which crops can survive at all, favouring hardy staples like potatoes and a grain called quinoa over almost anything else. It makes raising livestock a careful balancing act, which is part of why llamas and alpacas, animals already adapted to thin air and cold nights, became so central to both societies, providing wool, meat, and transport across terrain that would exhaust almost anything else. Water could be scarce in some seasons and dangerously abundant in others, arriving as flooding rain or, at the higher elevations, as snow that could bury fields for a stretch of the year. Any society that wanted to grow large in this environment had to solve serious engineering problems just to keep its population fed, long before it could think about temples, monuments, or expansion. And yet both Tiwanaku and Wari did grow large. Both of them solved, at least for a while, The problem of feeding thousands of people on ground that seems, at first glance, almost hostile to the idea of feeding anyone. Both of them built monumental architecture that required organising labour on a scale that implies real political authority, whatever form that authority actually took. Both of them left behind roads, storage systems, and religious sites that suggest societies confident enough in their own permanence to build for centuries, not just for the current generation. That confidence, as it turned out, was not entirely justified. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. For now, what matters is simply this: two civilizations, one mountain range, centuries of independent growth running in parallel, sometimes overlapping directly, on some of the most physically demanding terrain any large society has ever tried to settle. Tiwanaku near its lake, drawing pilgrims and traders across the Altiplano. Wari to the north, laying down roads and administrative centres with the kind of organised reach that historians are comfortable calling an empire, even while Tiwanaku's own political shape remains a matter of ongoing argument among the people who study it. Both of them built something remarkable out of thin air, cold soil, and short growing seasons. And both of them, within roughly the same narrow window of time, stopped. We will spend the rest of tonight walking through how each of them rose, what they built, and what little evidence survives to explain why, at nearly the same moment in history, on the same stretch of mountains, they both came to an end. If you were walking toward Tiwanaku during its height, you would not have seen a city rise suddenly out of the plain, the way later stone capitals sometimes do in people's imaginations. The Altiplano is wide and its horizons unfold slowly. First you would feel the land flatten after miles of broken ridges. Then, almost without noticing, you would find that the low, scattered dwellings of farming hamlets had thickened into something denser. More walls, more pathways, more people, and then at the centre of all of it, there would have been a shape that did not belong to the ordinary world at all. Tiwanaku grew up on a gently sloping terrace a few miles from Lake Titicaca's southern shore. From that vantage point, the water lies off to one side like a broad sheet of metal under the highland sky, and beyond it the Cordillera Real pushes snow-capped peaks up through the clouds. The city took that setting and layered human intention onto it, carving out open plazas, sunken courts and stepped platforms in straight lines that contrast sharply with the soft hills around them. By the time Tiwanaku reached its mature form, some time after 500 AD, it was no longer just a cluster of villages around a sacred core. Archaeological surveys suggest a complex urban zone stretching for kilometres, with residential areas, workshops and ritual spaces mingling together. People living in simple adobe compounds would have been able to look up from their doorways and see monumental stoneworks on the horizon, reminders that they were not just inhabitants of a town, but participants in something larger, something that radiated meaning across the Altiplano. At the literal and symbolic heart of this layout stood the Akapana. Today, the Akapana looks like a large, somewhat eroded hill. For a long time, that is exactly what many outsiders assumed it was, a natural rise in the ground with some later constructions on top. Excavation has made it clear that this hill is almost entirely man-made. It is an immense stepped platform mound, a kind of artificial mountain assembled block by block. The Akapana is roughly cross-shaped when seen from above, with broad terraces stepping up toward a flattened summit. Estimates vary slightly, but the structure measures on the order of 200 metres across and more than 15 metres high. Its builders used a mix of carefully fitted stone facing and a massive rubble core, tying the layers together with clay and smaller stones. This was not casual piling, it was engineering, scaled up to a point where it reshaped the skyline. On top of the mound, excavators have uncovered a complex system of sunken courts and channels carved in stone. Some of these channels are painstakingly cut in zigzag patterns, leading water from one basin to another. In the rainy season, if they were kept clear, these would have carried runoff across the summit and down through the terraces. There is evidence of drains that once directed water deliberately over the sides, turning the platform into a kind of controlled cascade. What exactly this was meant to symbolize remains open to interpretation, but the connection between mountains, water, and fertility is strong across the Andean world. High peaks catch clouds, snowmelt becomes streams, streams feed fields, fields feed people. The Akapana seems to take that natural cycle and translate it into architecture. An artificial high place with ritual water flowing down from its summit, overlooking a city whose life depended on the successful management of lakes, canals, and rain. The experience of ascending it would have reflected this symbolism. Visitors moving up through the terraces and courts would have been passing from one level of meaning to another, leaving behind the everyday flatness of the plain and entering an ordered vertical world. At the summit, surrounded by carved stones and the sound of water moving through hidden conduits, the Altiplano might have felt very far away, even though it lay on all sides. One of the striking things about the Akapana is that it was not built in a single burst. Excavation has revealed that the mound went through multiple construction phases. Earlier, smaller platforms seemed to lie buried within later expansions. Walls were faced, refaced, extended. Drainage systems were modified over time, suggesting that the way water was meant to flow across the structure changed as new ideas or new needs emerged. Some phases show more careful stonework, others more reliance on adobe and fill. This layered history hints at a city constantly reworking its own sacred core, rewriting its relationship to the landscape and to whatever powers it believed dwelt in the high places and the waters. Rather than a finished monument dropped into place, the Akapana feels more like a long-term project, a ceremonial machine being tuned and retuned across generations. Artifacts recovered from the mound and its surroundings reinforce the sense that this was a place of focused ritual rather than an ordinary administrative building. Offerings of ceramics, animal remains, and in some cases human remains have been found in specific locations, at corners, in buried chambers, near channel outlets. These placements suggest carefully planned depositions, acts meant to bind the structure to its purpose at each stage of its growth. And that purpose was not confined to the local community. Evidence from pottery styles, stone sources, and other materials indicates that people came to Tiwanaku from across a wide region. Some ceramics found in and around the Akapana show affinities with distant valleys and coastlines, suggesting that pilgrims brought offerings from their home territories, or that specialists arrived with their own ritual toolkits. The city appears to have functioned as a major ceremonial and pilgrimage centre for the southern Andes, a place where people from scattered communities gathered to take part in festivals, rituals, and exchange. This does not mean we can easily map our own political categories onto it. Some archaeologists see in Tiwanaku the outlines of a powerful expansionist state, projecting authority through colonies and control of key resources. Others argue that its reach may have been more about shared ritual, seasonal gatherings, and loosely governed networks of influence, with the monumental core serving as the anchor for a wide but uneven sphere of devotion. The Akapana, with its layered building phases and its blend of engineering and symbolism, fits comfortably into either picture as a central stage on which the city's public life unfolded. What is clear is that for centuries on that high plain by the lake, Tiwanaku used the Akapana and the surrounding ceremonial complex to knit people together. Farmers from the shores, herders from farther out on the Altiplano, traders from more distant lands, all climbing the same terraces, watching the same ritual water, standing in the shadow of the same stone-built mountain that humans, not geology, had lifted into the sky. Around this core, the rest of the city spread and adapted, sustained by an agricultural system that was itself an impressive piece of highland engineering. To understand how Tiwanaku could support the thousands of people who came to its plazas and platforms, we have to step away from the Akapana for a moment and look more closely at the ways they shaped the land itself. If the Akapana was Tiwanaku's raised mountain, Pumapunku was something stranger, lower to the ground, and in some ways even harder to understand. Today, when you walk out toward that part of the site, what you see first is not a towering structure, but a wide, low platform, half lost under wind-blown soil. Around it lie blocks that do not look like the worn, irregular stones of other ruined places. They look as if they were interrupted in the middle of a task that required impossible levels of care. Many of the stones at Pumapunku are andesite or red sandstone, quarried from distances that would have required deliberate planning and coordination to bridge. Some weigh dozens of tons. They are scattered now, toppled and broken, but when you move among them, you can still see the logic of their original intentions. Flat faces sheared in straight planes. Right angles that meet with a precision that, even in their damaged state, feels deliberate and exacting. The famous H blocks that have become icons of Pumapunku are part of this pattern. Each has a characteristic stepped shape, with recesses, projections and grooves cut into it. They are not identical, but they share a family resemblance, as if they were parts of some larger architectural language. On their surfaces you can see small drill holes, finely carved interior corners, and joints that suggest they were meant to interlock with other blocks in specific ways. It is tempting to focus only on the finish of these stones, but their ruin is just as striking. They do not sit in neat walls or tidy lines. Many lie overturned, split, or displaced. Some appear to have been wrenched from their original positions by enormous force. The platform itself shows signs of disruption, with blocks missing from corners and facing stones slipped from their beds. Whatever Pumapunku looked like at its height, what remains is a kind of carefully cut jigsaw puzzle scattered across the ground. The engineering questions this raises are straightforward, even if the answers remain incomplete. How did people working without iron tools, without wheeled vehicles, and without draft animals that could pull heavy loads across the Altiplano manage to quarry, move, shape and place these stones? Archaeologists and experimental engineers have offered practical possibilities. Stone can be shaped with harder stone tools, patience and technique, especially if the workers understand how to exploit natural fracture lines and use wet sand, abrasives and wooden or copper implements. Heavy blocks can be moved on sledges and rollers, dragged by teams of people along routes prepared in advance, perhaps over packed earth, reed mats, or prepared ramps. Simple levers, cribbing and earthen platforms can raise stones into place, one controlled increment at a time. The evidence on the ground supports such patient, incremental methods more than any idea of lost or exotic technologies. Partially finished blocks, abandoned in quarries or along transport routes, show stages of work in progress. The cuts and drill holes at Pumapunku are consistent with repetitive, labour-intensive procedures, not single miraculous interventions. This does not make them less remarkable. If anything, it emphasises the depth of organisation and the sustained effort that Tiwanaku could mobilise. Quarry sources for some of the red sandstone blocks lie across the lake on the Copacabana Peninsula. Moving stones that size from those quarries to the southern shore would have involved not just land transport, but also crossings on water or careful selection of overland detours around the lake's edge. This suggests coordination at a regional scale, people managing labour, timing and logistics across multiple communities and landscapes. What Pumapunku was for within that larger project remains a matter of discussion. It sits at the southwestern edge of the main ceremonial core, slightly apart from the Quelccaya and the Akapana. Some scholars see it as a monumental entry complex, a kind of formal threshold leading pilgrims and participants into Tiwanaku's inner sacred spaces. The broad platform, the large stairways, and the evident concern with controlled movement up and onto the structure fit with that interpretation. Others emphasize the evidence for sunken courts, restricted spaces, and carefully channeled access. From that perspective, Pumapunku might have supported more specialized rituals, perhaps tied to origin myths or particular deities, acting as a stage for ceremonies that mark transitions between outside and inside, water and land, earthly and ancestral realms. Still others proposed that its layout echoed cosmological ideas, perhaps mirroring distant mountains or constellations, though the specifics of such alignments are debated. Because the stones are so precise and the ruins so dramatic, Pumapunku has attracted a long line of speculative explanations that move far beyond what the material evidence requires. Claims about advanced lost civilizations or influences from elsewhere on the globe tend to rely on the emotional power of the ruins rather than on consistent archaeological data. When you look closely at tool marks, quarry sites and construction sequences, Pumapunku fits into the known range of Andean building traditions, pushed to an exceptional scale and refinement. This does not make it any less mysterious. The real mystery lies less in how the stones were shaped, and more in what it meant for a highland society to pour such tremendous energy into a single architectural complex. The precision we see on the ground implies trained specialists, standard measurements, and shared design templates. The sheer mass of the blocks implies organized labor, sustained over seasons or generations. The location, slightly offset from the rest of the monumental core, implies a deliberate statement about boundaries and beginnings. Pumapunku's grandeur, and its broken state today, also casts a long shadow over the story of Tiwanaku's end. At some point, the coordination that could plan quarries, move stones across water and plain, teach apprentices to carve sharp interior angles, and raise massive blocks into ordered forms, stopped. The platform was abandoned, the interlocking stones were left unassembled or later dislodged. Whatever rituals once began or culminated here, they no longer drew enough people to maintain the structure that framed them. When we stand among the overturned H-blocks and scattered sandstone slabs, we are looking at both extremes of the same process. The capacity of Tiwanaku to focus resources on a precise vision, and the eventual unravelling of that focus. To see how Pumapunku fit into the city's broader ceremonial landscape, we can turn from its ruined entryways to another monument nearby, one that still rises almost intact above the Altiplano, the famous carved portal known as the Gateway of the Sun. The Gateway of the Sun is, at first glance, a simple thing compared to the sprawling puzzle of Pumapunku. It is just one block, a great rectangular slab of andesite, a little over 3 meters high, with a single opening cut through its centre. It does not loom like a pyramid, or spread like a platform. It stands alone. What draws you in is not its size, but its surface. Across the lintel above the doorway runs a carved panel that seems dense and quiet at the same time. At the centre is a figure that Andean archaeologists call the staff god. The body is frontal and rigid, facing straight ahead. The head is large, encircled by a radiating headdress or halo with projections that end in small stylized heads. In both hands the figure grips long vertical objects, often interpreted as staffs or sceptres, each terminating in abstract shapes that may echo plants, animals, or ritual implements. The face has deep rectangular eyes with tear-like streams descending from them in straight vertical bands. The mouth is a tight horizontal bar. Around this central being, arranged in neat registers, are rows of smaller figures, some human-like, some more avian. Many appear in profile, with winged bodies and elaborate headdresses, moving toward the centre from both sides. Some are profile attendants, with human faces and wing-like arms. Others have bird heads, often compared to falcons or condors, their beaks sharp, their stance mid-stride. The whole composition is laid out with the same disciplined precision you see in Tiwanaku stonework. Lines are straight, angles are measured, repetitions are careful rather than mechanical. Yet the iconography is dense enough that your eye takes time to sort it. Once you notice the tear bands from the central figure's eyes, you start to see them across other Tiwanaku art. Once you recognize the small attendant figures with their bent knees and turned heads, you see them again on ceramics, textiles, and carved wooden objects from far beyond Lake Titicaca. The image on the gateway's lintel is sometimes compared to a woven textile frozen in stone. It has the same grid of units, the same balance between central motif and repeating border. This is not accidental. In the Andean world, cloth and image were tightly linked to status, ritual, and identity. To carve a textile-like composition into a single block of andesite is to make a permanent version of something usually soft, wearable, and mobile. Interpreting what this scene meant within Tiwanaku's own worldview is more difficult. The staff god figure has deep roots in Andean iconography. Earlier highland cultures, including those on the Peruvian coast and in the central Sierra, had already developed images of a central, front-facing deity holding vertical staffs, surrounded by attendant beings and geometric motifs. At Tiwanaku, this figure takes on a distinctive style, squared features, tear bands, radiating headgear, and accompanying winged attendants. Scholars often see this as a sky or weather-associated power, a being linked to rain, storms, and the cyclical renewal of life. The tears might be rain. The radiating headdress could suggest light or rays. The staffs could be axes of lightning or plant-like wands associated with agricultural fertility. The surrounding bird and human figures are sometimes understood as messengers or transformed beings moving between realms. Within that broad frame there is considerable debate. Some read the composition as a condensed cosmology, sky above, earthly powers below, ordered along an invisible axis that might have lined up with certain celestial events. Others emphasize its role as a political emblem, presenting a superhuman figure whose authority anchors the social and ritual order of Tiwanaku. The two interpretations do not exclude each other. In many traditional societies, cosmic order and political order are not separate things but reflections of the same pattern. What is clearer than the exact meaning of each symbol is the reach of this imagery. Variants of the staff god and its attendant beings appear on objects found far from the shores of Lake Titicaca, on fine polychrome ceramics in the Moquegua valleys, on portable wooden snuff tablets used for inhaling hallucinogenic powders, on metal ornaments, on textiles buried with the dead in coastal and highland communities hundreds of kilometers away. These are not casual decorations, the repetition of specific motifs, the tear-banded face, the step designs around heads and staffs, the orderly ranks of attendants suggests that people across a wide region were engaging with a shared symbolic language. Whether every community understood the figure in exactly the same way is uncertain, but the pattern itself travelled. It moved along trade routes, through marriage ties, with pilgrims, artisans, and specialists. In this sense, the Gateway of the Sun is both a monument in stone and a kind of key to Tiwanaku's wider influence. The city may not have sent out marching armies in the way later states did, and its classification as an empire remains debated, but its sacred images spread across the southern Andes. Some archaeologists see this as evidence of a hegemonic religious network, a system in which participation in Tiwanaku's rituals and adoption of its iconography helped integrate distant communities into a shared sphere. Others emphasize more direct forms of colonization and resource control organized from the Altiplano. The carved panel on the gateway sits quietly at the center of those discussions, a reminder that power can move as much through meaning as through force. Even the gateway's own context is not fully settled. The block as you see it today may not stand where it originally did. Evidence of ancient disturbances, later re-erections, and early modern reconstructions suggests that the portal was moved at least once, perhaps more than once. Some researchers propose that it was part of a larger, now lost wall or platform integrated into a sequence of passageways like those at Pumapunku and the Quelccaya. Others think it may have stood more freely, forming a focused threshold whose alignment had astronomical or ceremonial significance. Because of this uncertainty, its exact function remains open. It might have marked a limit between different ritual zones, a passage from more public spaces into more restricted areas. It might have framed important sightlines toward the mountains or the rising sun at particular times of year. It might also have served as a backdrop for processions, offerings, or performances that unfolded in the plaza before it, its carved deity presiding silently over human movement. Whatever its precise placement, the gateway suggests something important about how Tiwanaku projected itself beyond its walls. A shared image of a powerful composite being repeated on stone, ceramic, wood, and cloth could connect people who had never visited the monumental core. If you recognized the tear-banded face and the winged attendants, you were, in some sense, inside a larger story. To participate in that imagery, to use it in rituals, to install it in local shrines, may have been one way communities signalled their relationship to the Highland Centre. From this carved portal, with its dense band of symbols, we can move outward again to the landscape that made such a religious and political project possible. Tiwanaku's influence did not rest on stone alone. It was anchored in fields, canals, and raised earth that turned a high, cold plain into a productive heartland. To understand that side of their world, we have to leave the carved deity for a moment and walk out onto the Altiplano, among the patterned grids of earth and water that once fed the city, the raised fields known as Suka Kollu. Step out from the carved stone and you enter a different kind of monument, a landscape of low, regular shapes stretching across the flat plain around Lake Titicaca. To modern eyes, especially from above, it looks like a giant graph paper laid over the earth. Long, narrow ridges of soil, parallel to one another, separated by shallow channels of water. This is the world of the Suka Kollu, the raised field system that underpinned Tiwanaku's life at 3,800 meters. In Aymara, Suka Kollu can be translated in different ways, but the basic idea is straightforward. You mound earth into elongated platforms, usually a few meters wide and tens of meters long. Between them you excavate canals. The soil you dig from the channels helps build the raised strips higher. Over time, as you clean the canals and scoop out organic rich mud, you continue to heap it onto the ridges. The fields grow, not just in productivity, but literally in height and complexity. At this elevation, the challenge is not only water, but cold. Night frosts can come at almost any time of year. A few degrees of difference on a clear night can mean the distinction between a surviving quinoa plant and a blackened, ruined field. The genius of Suka Kollu lies in how they manipulate temperature as much as moisture. During the day, the water in the canals absorbs solar energy. It warms slowly but steadily as the sun crosses the high, thin air. The raised ridges with their dark, cultivated soil also capture heat. As night falls and the air temperature drops, the water begins to release the stored warmth. A thin layer of mist can form above the channels, a blanket of humid air that slows the rate at which frost can settle directly onto the plants growing on the adjacent ridges. This is not speculative. Experimental reconstructions of raised fields on the Altiplano in the late 20th century measured nighttime temperatures on and around Suka Kollu. They found that the combination of water, raised soil, and microtopography could keep plant surfaces a few degrees warmer, than in unmodified fields nearby. That margin is small in absolute numbers, but crucial in a place where crops live close to their cold tolerance. The canals also help moderate extremes in other ways. They catch runoff during rains, holding water that might otherwise pool and drown young plants. They can be linked into larger networks, so that excess water drains away toward lakes or rivers, reducing erosion. And because they accumulate organic material, algae, aquatic plants, decaying matter, they become a slow-moving nutrient reservoir. Periodically dredging this material and spreading it on the ridges enriches the soil without the need for external fertilizers. On the raised strips themselves, farmers could plant a mixed palette of Altiplano crops, tubers like potatoes and oca, grains and pseudo-grains like quinoa and canihua, perhaps fodder plants for camelids. The slight elevation of the ridges improves drainage in the wet season, while still giving roots access to moisture from the channels in drier periods. The result is a buffered environment, less exposed to the full violence of Andean frost, flood and drought. Scale matters here. To sustain a monumental centre like Tiwanaku, with its massive platforms, plazas and ritual installations, you need more than a few household gardens. Estimates of the city's population vary, and the numbers are debated, but scholars generally agree that feeding its residents, plus visitors for ceremonies and seasonal gatherings, required a very substantial agricultural base. Archaeologists have mapped Suka Kollu across broad swaths of the Tiwanaku heartland. In some areas, the patterned fields stretch for kilometres along lake margins and riverine flats. While exact figures depend on assumptions about yields, cropping intensity and diet, reconstruction suggests that, at their height, these systems could have produced food for tens of thousands of people, perhaps more when combined with other forms of cultivation, herding and imported goods. It is important not to imagine a single continuous carpet of raised fields, all managed from a central office. The evidence instead points to mosaics, zones of intensive Suka Kollu cultivation interwoven with other land uses, occupied and maintained by local communities who were linked, in different ways, to the ceremonial and administrative core. Some areas might have been closely tied to Tiwanaku's central authorities or temples, others more locally controlled, with obligations of tribute, labour or ritual participation. The archaeological record shows that raised field agriculture in the Titicaca Basin has a long history. There are indications of proto-Suka Kollu systems developing before Tiwanaku's rise, perhaps in earlier formative periods, as communities experimented with earthworks and water control. Under Tiwanaku influence, these techniques were elaborated and extended, reaching a spatial scale that left visible marks even after centuries of abandonment. After Tiwanaku's decline, the picture becomes more patchy. In some regions, there is clear evidence that raised fields fell out of use. Canals silted up, ridges eroded, and traditional ploughing and small plot farming replaced the intensive grid. In other places, elements of the system seem to have persisted or been reactivated intermittently. Colonial accounts, much later, describe Altiplano agriculture that, while different, still shows echoes of earlier practices in the way people managed water and soil. Why the Suka Kollu system declined is part of a broader, unsettled discussion. Some researchers emphasize social and political factors. The weakening of central coordination after Tiwanaku's collapse, the loss of labour mobilisation needed to maintain large hydraulic works, shifts in settlement patterns that made certain field complexes less practical to farm. Others point to environmental change, fluctuations in lake levels, altered rainfall regimes, and episodes of drought that might have made some raised field zones more difficult to sustain. There is also the question of knowledge transmission. Suka Kollu require not just one-time construction but ongoing maintenance and specialised understanding. When to dredge canals, how to rotate crops, how to respond to unusual weather. If the institutions that held and shared that knowledge were disrupted, the system could degrade rapidly, even if the physical earthworks remained. What is clear is that agriculture on the Altiplano was not a static backdrop to Tiwanaku's religious and political life. It was an active, engineered system, responsive to climate and society, capable of high productivity, but also vulnerable to disturbance. The raised fields and their canals were as much a part of Tiwanaku's infrastructure as its stone platforms and gateways. As we move later in the story into the centuries when both Tiwanaku in the south and Wari to the north faced stress and reorganization, this agricultural thread will return. Questions about water, frost, and food security will sit quietly in the background of debates about collapse. For now, it is enough to recognize that beneath the staff God's radiating headgear, beyond the sunken courts and carved blocks, lay a carefully crafted landscape, lines of earth and water that made a high, cold world support dense human life. When we call a place like Tiwanaku a state or an empire, we are doing more than choosing labels. We are deciding how to imagine the people who lived there, how they related to each other, and how power moved through their world. In the case of Tiwanaku, that decision is still very much open. The stones and fields are silent on this question. They tell us that someone could mobilize large amounts of labor, cut and move heavy blocks, maintain long stretches of Suka Kollu, and organize ritual events that drew people to the Akapana and the sunken courts. They do not tell us, on their own, whether this was done by a centralized government issuing commands, by temple authorities coordinating festivals and obligations, or by a looser web of communities who shared symbols and practices while keeping many decisions local. One influential reading of the evidence comes from the anthropologist Alan Kollu, who has spent years working in the Tiwanaku heartland. In his interpretation, Tiwanaku looks very much like an expansionist state. In this view, the monumental core is not just a pilgrimage centre, but a true capital, where political and religious authority converged. From here, rulers and their administrators extended control outward, first across the southern Titicaca basin, then into distant valleys and oases. Kollu's reconstruction emphasizes how raised field agriculture, combined with canal systems and storage facilities, could have produced a stable surplus. That surplus, in turn, would have supported specialists, stoneworkers, priests, administrators, and perhaps a standing corps of retainers or soldiers. He points to evidence of planned settlements in outlying regions, road-like corridors and installations that look, in plan, like colonies or garrisons. Together, these features can be read as the skeleton of a state that extracted tribute, moved goods, and projected power over long distances. In this model, Tiwanaku's reach is not just ideological. It is territorial. Provinces send food, textiles, and other products to the centre. The centre sends back prestige goods, ritual specialists, and political directives. Over time, the system knits highland and lowland zones into a single economic and administrative sphere, buffered against local crop failures by the ability to transport resources from one ecological tier to another. To Kollu and those who share his view, the scale of coordination implied by the agricultural works, the monumental investments, and the apparent planning in some satellite sites is best explained by an organized hierarchical state that behaves in many ways like an empire. But this is only one side of the discussion. Other scholars looking at the same stones and soils see a different shape. They agree that Tiwanaku exercised wide influence, but they locate that influence primarily in the realm of ritual and imagery, not in direct day-to-day control over land and people. In this alternative view, Tiwanaku is a hegemonic ritual centre, a place whose ceremonies, gods and iconography radiated outward across the south-central Andes. Communities in distant valleys adopted Tiwanaku symbols, staff-bearing deities, stepped motifs, specific ceramic styles, because those symbols carried prestige and meaning, not necessarily because a governor from Lake Titicaca was stationed among them. Archaeological traces that might look like colonies under an imperial lens can be reinterpreted as enclaves of artisans, ritual specialists, or trading partners. Rather than a single uniform provincial system, there may have been multiple kinds of relationships, some areas tied closely to the core through marriage, pilgrimage, and shared ceremonies, others engaging more intermittently, sending delegations for festivals, adopting certain iconographic packages, but retaining local political autonomy. In this reading, the Suka Kollu and other hydraulic works in the heartland are still important, but they are part of a sacred landscape as much as a fiscal one. Ritual calendars might have been keyed to agricultural cycles. Offerings and processions might have moved along the same causeways that carried potatoes and quinoa. Instead of taxes and decrees, the glue of the system is devotion, reciprocity, and the desire to participate in a powerful ritual order centered at Tiwanaku. Within this framework, Tiwanaku's presence in far-off regions like the Moquegua Valley or parts of coastal Chile is seen less as a firm annexation and more as a network of ritual and colonial outposts. These enclaves could house Tiwanaku-affiliated groups, families, lineages, or cult communities who lived alongside local populations, intermarried, exchanged goods, and mediated between the highland centre and the local landscape. Power here is relational and negotiated, rather than strictly imposed. Material culture supports both readings in different ways. On the one hand, certain regions show architectural and ceramic styles that are closely standardized with the Tiwanaku heartland, suggesting some form of strong connection. On the other hand, many supposed Tiwanaku provinces lack clear evidence of full-scale administrative infrastructure, such as dense bureaucratic records or uniform residential patterns, that we might expect from a tightly managed empire. Patterns of consumption can also be read in multiple ways. High-status goods bearing Tiwanaku iconography appear in some elite graves and ceremonial contexts across the Andes. This can be seen as the mark of imperial redistribution, or as evidence that local elites sought out Tiwanaku-linked objects to enhance their own standing, much as later Andean nobles would value certain textiles or metals because of their association with particular shrines or lineages. Linguistic and ethno-historic hints complicate the picture further. Later chronicles describe sacred centers and pilgrimage circuits that predate the Inca, with people traveling long distances to honor specific mountains, islands, and temples. Some researchers see Tiwanaku as an early anchor point in such a landscape of shrines, not a central office controlling everything, but a powerful node in a continent-spanning web of ritual obligations and exchanges. Because of this, modern scholarship often uses more cautious language for Tiwanaku than for its northern counterpart. Wari is routinely described as an empire, with administrative centres, planned provincial cities, and clearer signs of territorial governance, while Tiwanaku's imperial status is actively debated, somewhere between an expansionist state in Kolata's sense and a hegemonic ritual and colonial network. The difference is not just semantic, it shapes how we think about Tiwanaku's end. If we imagine an empire in the strong sense, its decline might involve the breakdown of centralized command, loss of control over distant provinces, and the unraveling of a fiscal system. If we imagine a ritual hegemon, its fading might be more about shifts in belief, changes in pilgrimage routes, or the loss of confidence in a particular sacred center's ability to mediate between humans, water, and sky. For now, the evidence does not compel a single answer. Excavations continue to add detail to both pictures, finding hints of administrative practice here, signs of negotiated ritual relationships there. Different valleys may have stood in different kinds of relationships to Tiwanaku at the same time, some close to the model of a province, others more like allied sanctuaries. In this gentle uncertainty, Tiwanaku remains a little elusive. It is clearly more than a single city, clearly more than a loose scattering of villages, but whether we should imagine it as an empire in the strict sense, or as something more diffuse and ritual-centred, is still an open question. As we turn northward to the Wari heartland and its planned installations, the contrast will become part of the story, but the ambiguity surrounding Tiwanaku will remain, settled only by sleep, not by consensus. By the time Europeans first walked across the Altiplano, Tiwanaku had already been gone for centuries. Its canals had filled, its courts had silted, its carved faces stared out over fields that no longer answered to its calendars. The system, whatever it had been, had done its work and fallen silent. What remained were stones, wind, and stories. In 1549, a young Spaniard named Pedro Cieza de León passed through this landscape. He was not an architect or an archaeologist. He was a soldier and a chronicler, moving through the Andes with the early colonial campaigns, trying to write down what he saw before it disappeared under new governments and new religions. He came to the shores of Lake Titicaca, to a place that local people called Tiwanaku. The buildings were broken, but they were still imposing. Even after centuries of abandonment, they carried a weight that unsettled him. Cieza tried to put that feeling into words. He wrote in his Chronicle of Peru, "In this place there are very ancient remains of buildings which show they must have been made with great art and by very clever workmen. And although at present there are only ruins, yet they are so great that in my judgment they surpass the buildings of the Incas, famed in this land." He walked among the monoliths and the cut stones, and he tried to imagine the hands that had shaped them. Some of the blocks, he noted, were worked with such precision that a knife blade could barely find a gap. The scale was more than he expected in a landscape that, to his eye, seemed remote and thinly populated. Cieza was especially struck by the sense that he was arriving late, that the story of this place belonged to some much older time. He paid attention not just to the stones, but to what people told him about them. And what they told him was striking. He recorded that when he asked who had built these works, the local authorities and elders did not claim them. They said the ruins were the work of ancient peoples long gone. Some associated them with the culture hero Viracocha, an ordering figure in Andean myth. Others simply said that they had been made before the Inca, and that the true builders were unknown. Cieza wrote, "When I questioned the Indians who live in this region as to who had made these buildings and from what age they date, they replied that they had always heard from their ancestors that they were made in a time before the Inca, and that they did not know who made them. Only that they had been told that in ancient times certain bearded men had built them in a single night. The detail about bearded men is not a reliable historical note. It is part of a mythic register, perhaps reshaped in the early colonial moment. What matters in the calm light of distance is something simpler. By the mid-16th century, the people of the region already experienced Tiwanaku as an inheritance without a clear author. The Inca themselves, whose power had recently dominated the highlands, seemed to have treated Tiwanaku as an ancient sacred site rather than a remembered capital. Other chroniclers describe Inca rituals conducted there, offerings left at the carved monoliths, and lineages tracing parts of their origin stories to Lake Titicaca and its islands. Yet when they spoke to Spaniards about who had raised the great stones of Tiwanaku, they too placed the builders in a vague, deep past. There is a quiet significance in this. The Inca state expanded rapidly across the Andes in the 15th century, incorporating an immense range of local histories, shrines and lineages. Its specialists collected origin myths, catalogued sacred places and kept records on knotted cords. If any group in that late pre-Columbian world might have preserved a memory of Tiwanaku's political order, names of dynasties, lists of conquests, episodes of foundation, it would have been them. Instead, what appears in the written record is a softer kind of memory. Tiwanaku is remembered as a place of marvels, as a landscape where important things happened in the age of the ancestors, but not as a sequence of rulers and wars. The fine grain of its politics, whether state or ritual network, had already dissolved into legend long before the first European chroniclers picked up their pens. For the purposes of our story, Cieza de León's testimony sits at a gentle turning point. On one side stand the centuries when Tiwanaku was active, its raised fields carefully tended, its processions moving along causeways, its carved deities receiving offerings from visitors who had come from distant valleys and coasts. On the other side are the centuries when the same stones lay open to the sky, their builders unnamed, their meanings partly reassigned by later pilgrims. Cieza does not bridge that gap with explanations. He simply notes the fact of the ruins, the skill they display, and the absence of clear local knowledge about their makers. His words float over the site like a quiet echo of all the conversations that must have taken place there, as people tried to fit an older order into the narratives of their own time. For us, centuries after Cieza, his account is a reminder of how long Tiwanaku has been an enigma. It was already old when Inca armies marched past it. It was already mysterious when Spanish horses first crossed its fields. The silence we encounter in the archaeological record today, the lack of texts, the fragmentary clues is part of a longer silence that had already settled over the site by the 1500s. At the same time, Cieza's description reassures us that the ruins we study are not a modern fantasy. He walked among many of the same features we know, the great platforms, the carved figures, the carefully shaped blocks that would later be called part of Pumapunku and the Akapana. The continuity between his observations and present-day archaeology is a thin, steady line connecting Tiwanaku's last glow of living memory to our own efforts to understand it. From here it is possible to move northward in thought, away from the shores of Lake Titicaca and toward another highland centre that would also rise, flourish and fade before the Spanish arrived. While Tiwanaku became an ancestral puzzle to the Inca, Wari left its own pattern of planned compounds, gridded streets, and provincial installations. Cieza himself would pass through some of those landscapes as well, writing down what little was still remembered, before time and sleep folded those memories into the broader quiet of the Andes. If you follow Cieza's path northward in your mind, away from Lake Titicaca and the open Altiplano, the landscape begins to change. The air is still thin, but the valleys grow steeper, the mountains closer, the bands of cultivation more tightly wrapped around the hillsides. Somewhere in this terrain, in what is now the Ayacucho region of Peru, another power had once taken shape. Later chroniclers would call it Wari after the place, and Wari after the people and their state. Long before the first Spaniards saw it, Wari had already been a quiet place again. Its walls partly collapsed, its courtyards filled with soil and refuse. But in its time it was something unusual in the central Andes, a large, dense and carefully organized city, built at high altitude with a complexity that encouraged archaeologists to use a more direct word for it. Where Tiwanaku's status as an empire remains a matter of debate, some, like Kollu, seeing it as an expansionist state, others as a hegemonic ritual and colonial network held together by pilgrimage and ideology. Wari is more conventionally described as an empire in the straightforward sense of a territorial, administrative power. The capital itself helps explain why. Wari was not a lakeside ceremonial centre, ringed by raised fields. It was a sprawling highland city covering several square kilometres, with a population that may have reached into the tens of thousands at its height. Instead of a single monumental core surrounded by open space, Wari was a patchwork of walled compounds, crowded architecture, and carefully controlled passages. The impression, when we try to reconstruct it from excavations and survey maps, is of density, people, storage, workshops and officials packed into a built environment that had been thought through in advance. Wari sat on a plateau above the surrounding valleys, chosen not for scenic effect but for strategic and practical reasons: access to water, proximity to routes crossing the mountains, defensible edges. Within that plateau, the builders divided the city into sectors, each with its own clusters of rectangular enclosures. High walls defined the boundaries of these compounds, blocking long views and controlling entry. From above, the plan reads as a mosaic: blocks of buildings, gridded or at least rectilinear, pressed together like pieces of a puzzle. Inside the compounds, the architecture took on a rhythm. Long, narrow halls lined central courtyards. Smaller rooms opened off from larger plazas. Some spaces were clearly for storage, full of large jars for food and drink. Others bore traces of more specialized activity: fine ceramics, textiles, ritual objects. Movement between compounds passed through controlled doorways and gateways. This was not a town that had grown up organically over centuries of household decisions. It was a place that had been designed, then revised, by planners who were thinking in terms of sectors, functions and hierarchies. Archaeologists see in this layout the marks of an administrative capital. There are indications of production, crafts, food processing, perhaps brewing. But the scale of storage and the separation between sectors suggest something more than neighbourhood economies. Wari appears to have concentrated surplus from a broader hinterland, bringing in goods and labour from other regions and redistributing them through bureaucratic channels that we can now only infer. The lack of written records makes it difficult to describe those channels in detail, but the built environment itself speaks of offices, officials and organised work. There is also a sense of planning over time. Wari was not built in a single act. Some compounds show evidence of remodelling, with walls patched, rooms subdivided, entrances moved or closed. New sectors were added as the city grew, maintaining the same general architectural vocabulary: thick masonry walls, orthogonal layouts, inward-focused courtyards. The result, by its middle and late phases, was a capital that combined monumentality with a somewhat opaque interior life. Public squares on the scale of Tiwanaku's open courts are rarer. Enclosed spaces where access could be regulated are more common. From this core, Wari influence extended outward in many directions. Unlike Tiwanaku, which radiated power most strongly across the Altiplano and adjoining valleys, Wari embedded itself across a longer north-south span of the central Andes. Traces of Wari presence can be found on the coast, in intermontane valleys, and high up on ridges and plateaus. Sometimes that presence is expressed through full-scale installations planned in ways that echo the capital. Sometimes it appears more lightly in pottery styles, textile motifs, and architectural details that signal affiliation. The picture that emerges is of a state that projected authority using both physical infrastructure and a shared visual language. Standardized Wari ceramic styles, polychrome vessels with characteristic iconography, show up far from Ayacucho. So do certain ways of cutting and assembling stone and certain layouts of walled compounds. These repetitions suggest more than simple trade. They imply the movement of officials, artisans and ideas, carrying a particular way of organizing space and material culture into new regions. Yet the nature of that expansion remains a subject of ongoing discussion. In some places, Wari compounds stand apart from local settlements, like administrative enclaves inserted into existing landscapes. In others, Wari elements are woven into local styles, hinting at negotiated arrangements rather than straightforward conquest. There are signs of direct control in some valleys, of alliance and influence in others. The empire that scholars describe is not a single monolithic block, but a patchwork of stronger and weaker ties adjusted to local conditions. Wari, at the centre of this system, seems to have functioned as a kind of coordinating engine. Goods flowed in, maize and other crops from lower valleys, camelid products from the highlands, perhaps tribute in labour and craft items from a variety of subject or allied communities. From the capital, textiles, ceramics and other prestige items moved out again, along with the people who used them to mark rank, office and connection to the Wari court. In this way, the physical city and the wider network reinforced one another. The compounds in Ayacucho structured daily life for administrators and craft specialists, while the installations and communities beyond supplied the resources that made that life possible. When we hold Tiwanaku and Wari side by side in thought, their differences are gentle but steady. Tiwanaku's heartland was an engineered landscape of fields and canals, its monumental stone platforms oriented to the lake and the sky. Wari's heartland, by contrast, was a crowded highland city that seems to have expressed power through enclosure, storage, and the repeated geometry of its compounds. Tiwanaku's influence radiated strongly through ritual imagery and agricultural systems. Wari's left a clearer trail of administrative architecture and standardized goods. Both, however, were deeply Andean in their own ways, rooted in the same long tradition of terracing, herding and vertical exchange that tied coast, valley and high plateau together. Both developed ways to manage people, water and crops across difficult terrain, and both, at their heights, extended their reach far beyond their original cause, turning particular mountains and valleys into nodal points in wider networks. From Wari, those networks led outward to places that can still be traced today, planned provincial centres laid out on ridges, unfinished complexes in northern valleys, and ritual industrial sites where large quantities of food and drink were prepared for special occasions. Each of these installations carried pieces of the capital's logic into new settings. In the next steps of our quiet journey, we can visit some of them in turn, and watch how the Wari way of building and governing unfolded across the landscape. If we follow one of those outward running lines from Wari, it brings us toward the Cuzco Basin, long before Cuzco was a capital of anything. Southeast of the later Inca city, on a terrace above the Lucre Basin, another Wari experiment in building and control took shape. Today it is called Pikillacta, often translated as Fleatown, though its ancient name is unknown. The modern nickname does not suit it very well. Nothing about Pikillacta feels haphazard or insect-like. It is one of the most rigorously planned places in the pre-Inca Andes. On a gently sloping alluvial fan, Wari architects imposed order. They levelled and terraced the surface, then overlaid it with long straight lines of wall. The result, when we look at the plan, is a dense grid. Parallel avenues running roughly north-south, crossed by shorter east-west connectors, enclosing blocks that are themselves filled with regular rectangular compounds. There is very little of the curving, adaptive geometry that you see in many Andean villages, where paths follow contours and houses twist to fit awkward patches of ground. Pikillacta looks as if it was drawn with a ruler. Each block contains its own internal world. High outer walls seal it off from the streets, with only a few narrow doorways giving access. Inside, smaller rooms and patios are arranged in rows around open courtyards. The rooms are long and tight, often with benches or low platforms. Passages bend and kink, never allowing an easy straight line of sight. It is easy to imagine these as units under close supervision, places where people might have slept, stored goods, or carried out tasks under the eyes of a few gatekeepers. Across the whole site, this pattern repeats with almost hypnotic regularity. Long ranges of cell-like rooms, orthogonal corners, standardized widths and proportions. Even without written plans, the builders were clearly working from a shared mental template, adjusting very little as they went. This is not a town that grew incrementally from a first cluster of houses. Pikillacta appears in the archaeological record more as a single decisive project, an entire layout conceived in advance then executed over a relatively short span of time. Because of this regularity, Pikillacta is sometimes described as a planned city, a phrase that conjures images of dense crowds and constant movement. Yet when archaeologists have looked closely at the traces left in its rooms and streets, the picture becomes softer and a little puzzling. For a place that could have housed many thousands of people, or at least contained their workspaces and storerooms, the evidence for sustained, large-scale, permanent residence is thinner than the strict geometry would suggest. Some rooms contain hearths, domestic refuse, and the kinds of broken everyday objects that accumulate when people live in a space year after year. But these are not as widespread as in more clearly residential settlements. Many compounds show relatively light deposits, more consistent with intermittent use than with continuous occupation. Large parts of the site seem to have been kept very clean, with few middens, and only limited build-up of trash. The scale of storage is also ambiguous. Pikillacta's long rooms could have held substantial amounts of grain, dried tubers or textiles stacked and managed by officials. Yet the direct evidence, rows of storage jars or thick layers of spilled crops, is scattered rather than universal. Some compounds look more like administrative suites, with a mixture of reception patios, small work areas, and restricted interior rooms, than like warehouses or crowded housing blocks. Because of this, interpretations of Pikillacta's function fan out gently in several directions. One line of thought emphasizes administration. In this view, Pikillacta was a provincial headquarters, a place where Wari officials oversaw local production in the Cuzco region, collected surplus, organized labor drafts, and maintained records in perishable media. The grid of compounds would then map onto offices, barracks for rotating laborers, storerooms, and controlled spaces for meeting local leaders. Another tradition of interpretation highlights ceremony and gathering. Pikillacta contains a few broader open spaces and unusual structures, including long galleries and possible special enclosures on its margins. Some researchers suggest that the site may have functioned as a kind of regional court and ritual centre, activated during festivals or periodic events. Under this model, the many rooms could have been used to host visitors from surrounding communities, to store offerings, or to prepare food and drink for large, intermittent gatherings, rather than to house a permanent, dense population. A third approach combines these readings. Pikillacta could have been both an administrative node and a ceremonial venue, with quiet stretches of controlled bureaucratic activity punctuated by periods when the place filled with people, sound and colour. The sparse everyday debris would then reflect careful management of space, and relatively short episodes of intensive use rather than simple abandonment. There is also the question of completion. Some sectors at Pikillacta show signs of being finished, plastered and used. Others are rougher, with evidence that construction stopped before every planned feature was fully realised. This lends the site a faint sense of suspension, as though the project was halted while still in motion. A city laid out with extreme precision, partially brought into active life, and then left behind before it achieved the bustling density its plan could have supported. To modern eyes, this is one of Pikillacta's quiet strangenesses. We are used to associating gridded plans with intense urban life, crowded markets, constant traffic, and heavy wear on streets and thresholds. Pikillacta offers a different image. The grid is there, insistent and clear, but the archaeological footprint of bodies and fires and refuse feels lighter, as though the architecture was out in front of the demography. The state, in this corner of the Andes, seems to have built an instrument for control that was more ambitious than its actual day-to-day deployment. Placed back into the wider Wari network, this makes a certain kind of sense. From Wari, elites dispatched planners, architects and specialists to key points along important routes. The Cuzco Basin was one of those points, a crossroads between highland and jungle, between different streams of exchange. By raising Pikillacta over the Lucra Basin, Wari inscribed its presence onto the landscape in a dense, unmistakably foreign pattern, distinct from local settlement forms. Even if not every room was full, the very act of imposing that order would have signalled authority. Local communities visiting the site for audiences or rituals would have passed through straight streets and high walls that echoed the geometry of the distant capital. Officials stationed there, whether year-round or in rotations, could rely on a built environment that supported surveillance, storage, and regulated access. Surplus moving through the basin could be diverted, counted, and redistributed within those rectilinear compounds. Seen in this way, Pikillacta becomes less of an underused city and more of a carefully placed node in a provincial strategy. Wari did not need to fill every room all the time for the site to work as intended. Its presence, its plan, and its occasional activation for ceremony or administration may have been enough to knit the Cuzco region into a broader web of obligations and benefits. As with much in this story, the details remain open. We cannot reconstruct the full rhythm of life inside those walls, or the exact balance between office, storehouse, and ritual hall. What we can say is that Pikillacta shows Wari carrying the logic of Wari, enclosure, rectilinear planning, and controlled passage into a new landscape, and in the process giving the central Andes one of its most striking examples of a planned but only partly inhabited city. If Pikillacta shows us a Wari plan that was built and then underfilled, Viracochapampa farther to the north gives us something slightly different again. A plan that seems to have been set in motion, expanded confidently, and then allowed to stall before it was fully realized. Viracochapampa lies outside the modern city of Huamachuco in the northern highlands of Peru. This is a greener, more dissected landscape than the Cuzco Basin, with ridges and valleys stepping down toward the coast. In Wari times, the region sat at the intersection of routes linking the central Sierra to the north coast valleys and to the interior. It makes sense that Wari planners would want a foothold here, a place where they could watch, and perhaps channel, the movement of people and goods across ecological zones. They chose a high, broad terrace, close to 3,000 meters above sea level. From there, the ground falls away towards surrounding basins, giving long views and a clear sense of command over the landscape. On this plateau, Wari builders marked out a large rectangular enclosure, its perimeter defined by substantial walls. Inside and outside that rectangle, they began to raise the characteristic Wari palette of compounds, open courts and narrow passages. Even in its unfinished state, the ambition is obvious. The central walled compound alone covers an area comparable to a small town. Within it, elongated patios, modular room blocks, and axial passages separate more open courts from tighter, more controlled interior spaces. Around the core, satellite enclosures and annexes extend the built area into a loose stepped pattern, as if the original nucleus had generated successive rings of construction. Archaeologists have argued that Viracochapampa was intended as a major administrative centre, perhaps the principal Wari node in this northern sector. Its position along travel routes, the scale of its enclosing walls, and the regularity of its internal layout have all been read as signs of a place built to concentrate authority. Like Pikillacta, it wears the mental template of Wari on its surface, translated into local stone. Yet when we look closely at the masonry and the sequence of building, a more hesitant picture emerges. Many of the perimeter walls are complete and imposing, with carefully fitted faces and neatly aligned doorways. Some interior courts show similar care, with finished surfaces and evidence of use, hearths, discarded sherds, traces of domestic and craft activities. But in other sectors, walls taper off abruptly, foundations lie exposed without their planned superstructures, and doorways open onto spaces that were never fully defined. In several compounds, builders laid out the footings of rooms and corridors, then stopped before raising them to full height. Elsewhere, courses of stone begin in fine, regular blocks and end in rougher, less standardized work, as though construction was being rushed or carried out by less experienced crews toward the end. Some intended enclosures appear only as stubs and alignments, ghosted in the ground plan but never fully materialized. The overall impression is of a project that advanced in stages, with some sectors brought to a usable state, others left in varying degrees of partial completion, and a few scarcely begun. This is different from a settlement that grows piecemeal over centuries. The geometry of the place, the coherence of its main axes and enclosures, signal a single overarching design, but the execution seems to have been interrupted before that design could be completed. The archaeological deposits echo this asymmetry. In the areas that were finished, there is evidence of occupation, scattered domestic refuse, broken serving vessels, traces of small-scale craft production and feasting. The occupational layers, however, are not especially thick. They suggest sustained but not extremely long use, measured perhaps in generations rather than in many centuries. In the unfinished or barely started sectors, use is much lighter or absent altogether. This has led many researchers to describe Viracochapampa as an abandoned construction site, or at least as a centre whose building program was curtailed earlier than originally planned. The reasons for this remain open to debate, and they may not reduce to any single cause. One line of interpretation focuses on chronology. Viracochapampa seems to belong to a relatively late phase of Wari expansion into the north. In this view, the interruption of construction could reflect shifts back at the core, political change at Wari, a redirection of labour and resources to other fronts, or a deliberate decision to scale back the northern programme. The planners might have imagined a larger complex, only to find that the state's capacity to support such projects was ebbing. Another suggestion turns our attention outward, to local dynamics. The Huamachuco region had its own traditions of monumental building and its own political actors. It is possible that Wari efforts to install a new administrative node ran into resistance, negotiation, or competition that made the original blueprint less feasible. The unfinished sectors might then speak to a compromise, enough construction to mark presence and accommodate a garrison of officials and dependents, but not the full realization of the architect's first intentions. Environmental and economic factors have also been considered. Changes in rainfall patterns, disease affecting crops or herds, or shifts in trade routes between highlands and coast could all have made Viracochapampa less attractive as a focus of investment. If caravans began to favour different passes, or if local populations moved their fields and villages, the calculus behind a large administrative centre on that particular terrace might have weakened. It is also possible that internal Wari politics played a part. Like any large, complex society, Wari was not a monolith. Factions, rival lineages, or competing provincial interests may have backed different projects. A change in the balance of power at Wari could have cut the flow of support to Viracochapampa, leaving its officials to make do with a half-completed installation. Whatever the combination of causes, the result on the ground is tangible, a place where the architecture runs out mid-sentence. Compared with Pikillacta, the handling of incompleteness has a different flavour. Pikillacta's grid is largely built out and coherent, but the traces of everyday use are lighter than the plan would lead us to expect. Viracochapampa, in contrast, seems to have had some degree of active life in certain sectors, while large portions of its designed fabric were never finished at all. Put side by side, the two sites trace a subtle pattern. In the Cuzco Basin, the state extended its rectilinear logic over an entire terrace, then inhabited it less intensively than its full capacity. In the Northern Highlands, the state committed to a grand administrative rectangle and its satellites, then stepped back before the project was fully built out. Neither place is a ruin of total failure. Both show evidence of function, ceremony, and administration. But both also carry in their plans a faint record of limits. These limits are important because they appear before the clear signs of widespread disintegration in the Wari network. Viracochapampa's halted walls and Pikillacta's underused rooms may mark points where the reach of Wari's planners slightly exceeded what could be sustained on the ground. Not a dramatic collapse, not a sudden catastrophe, but small asymmetries between intention and realization. Rid gently. They suggest that by the time these provincial centres were being planned and built, Wari's ability to project power and maintain long-term projects across vast distances was already under some strain. The empire, as it is conventionally called in scholarship, was still very much active, but its outermost expressions were beginning to show a certain fragility in the edges of their stone, south of Viracochapampa and Pikillacta, closer to the heartland of Wari. Another kind of place helps us see Wari from a different angle. Where those northern and southern centres speak in rectilinear compounds and unfinished walls, Conchopata speaks in clay. Conchopata lies on a terrace just outside modern Ayacucho, not far from the presumed location of the Wari capital. In Wari times, this area was part of the core landscape, a zone of dense settlement and long-term investment. Yet Conchopata is not simply a suburb or an overflow neighbourhood. Its archaeology points to a site that combined everyday life with specialised craft production and repeated ceremonial activity. The most striking evidence is the pottery. Excavations at Conchopata have recovered large quantities of ceramics, and not just in the form of ordinary cooking pots or simple bowls. There are thick scatters of wasters, misfired vessels, broken in production, and concentrations of kiln fragments and firing debris. These are the signatures of a workshop community. Clay was being shaped, slipped, painted and fired here on a substantial scale. Many of the finished pieces, or their surviving fragments, fall into recognisably Wari styles, fine polychrome serving vessels, tall cylindrical beakers and large storage jars. Some show the standardised, almost modular designs associated with official Wari iconography. Stepped motifs, profile heads, abstracted feline and bird figures arranged in repeating panels. Others are more local in flavour, with variations in shape or surface treatment that speak to neighbourhood preferences and individual hands. Conchopata's potters were not just turning out utilitarian wares. Among the most remarkable finds are fragments of very large, thin-walled urns and oversized beakers decorated with elaborate painted scenes. These vessels, often referred to as ceremonial, seem to have been made specifically for feasting and ritual use. Their size, fragility, and iconography set them apart from the more robust containers used in daily cooking and storage. The context of these finds reinforces that impression. Many of the ceremonial vessels appear in association with open patios and activity areas that show dense layers of ash, food remains, and broken serving wares. These are the archaeological traces of gatherings: food prepared in quantity, drink consumed, vessels used, and then discarded or intentionally broken. At Conchopata, feasting does not appear as a rare, exceptional event, but as something woven into the site's regular rhythm. Breaking seems to have been part of the ritual itself. In several sectors, archaeologists have found concentrations of smashed ceremonial vessels arranged in shallow pits or spreads, with little evidence that the pieces were trampled or moved far after deposition. This suggests structured episodes of use and discard, in which large symbolically charged containers were filled, emptied, and then destroyed in a controlled way. The fragments, sometimes carefully placed, became part of the ritual landscape. These rituals were not simple neighbourhood affairs. The iconography on the finest Conchopata pieces draws on a wider repertoire of Andean sacred imagery. Human figures in elaborate headdresses, staff-bearing beings, rayed heads, and hybrid creatures appear on the surfaces, rendered with careful brushwork. Some of these motifs are recognisably Wari. Others, though, connect outward to Tiwanaku. On a number of Conchopata vessels, researchers have identified images that echo, sometimes very closely, the figures carved on Tiwanaku's monuments, particularly the Gateway of the Sun and other sculpted stones on the Altiplano. Central frontal beings holding staffs, flanked by rows of smaller attendant figures, appear in painted form on clay, their headdresses and attributes recalling the icon of the so-called staff god or gateway deity that dominates Tiwanaku's stone reliefs. The parallels are not perfect copies like a photograph reproduced again and again. They are interpretations, translations of stone into paint, and of one regional style into another. A headdress may change shape, a set of wings may be simplified, a border pattern may be rendered in a distinctly Wari graphic vocabulary. But the underlying structure of the compositions and the central presences they celebrate link Conchopata's ceramics to a visual tradition centred many hundreds of kilometres away on the southern shore of Lake Titicaca. This shared imagery has attracted a great deal of scholarly attention because it suggests that whatever connected Wari and Tiwanaku was not simply a matter of traders passing through with bags of exotic goods. The potters at Conchopata were not just copying a stray imported bowl. They were participating in a wider conversation about sacred figures and cosmological order, using Tiwanaku-related motifs in ways that seem integrated into Wari ceremonial life. How that conversation took place remains open. Some archaeologists have proposed direct contact, Wari envoys or artisans travelling to Tiwanaku, witnessing ceremonies, and returning with mental images and perhaps actual objects to be reworked in the Ayacucho workshops. Others emphasize the possibility of intermediary communities, especially in the southern highlands and the transitional valleys, who might have circulated ideas and iconography along with textiles, metals, and other prestige goods. Whatever the precise pathways, Conchopata's ceramics encourage us to think about Wari-Tiwanaku relations as more than a dichotomy of conquest or isolation. It is clear that Wari, conventionally described as an empire in the literature, built and governed a network of provincial centres. Tiwanaku's status is more debated. Some researchers, such as John Kulata, see it as an expansionist state, while others argue for a form of hegemonic ritual and colonial network spread through colonists and pilgrimage. Conchopata rests in the middle of this conceptual field, showing a Wari community deeply engaged with a repertoire of symbols that came, at least in part, from beyond its own political tradition. The emphasis on feasting is especially suggestive. In many complex societies, shared meals and drinking events are central tools of diplomacy and alliance building. If Conchopata was a place where Wari elites gathered, drank from vessels bearing Tiwanaku-style imagery, and conducted rituals around those images, then we may be looking at one of the mechanisms through which ideas, and perhaps people, moved across the central Andes. Feasts here could have honoured distant deities, affirmed local authority, and signalled connections that crossed political boundaries. At the same time, Conchopata was not a passive recipient of foreign symbols. The workshop evidence and the range of styles indicate that local potters and patrons were actively selecting, modifying, and combining motifs. Tiwanaku-related figures appear alongside distinctly Wari elements, woven into compositions that would have made sense within Wari ceremonial frameworks. The resulting imagery is hybrid rather than derivative, grounded in the specific social world of Ayacucho. Seen in this light, Conchopata becomes an important bridge in our story. Its kilns and feasting patios tie the administrative landscapes of Pikillacta and Viracochapampa to the broader arena of Andean ritual exchange. Its painted vessels show Wari hands working with Tiwanaku themes, suggesting a world in which ideas flowed along with people and goods, through channels of cooperation, emulation, and selective borrowing, as much as through military pressure. As we leave the workshops and patios of Conchopata, the lines of connection it traces lead us south and up, toward a high, isolated mountain in the Moquegua Valley. There on Cerro Baúl, the architectural language of Wari and the ritual imagery associated with Tiwanaku will come together in stone and space, giving us a rare, concentrated glimpse of how two great Andean traditions once shared a single ridge. Cerro Baúl rises above the Moquegua Valley like a table left in the middle of a room. Steep cliffs drop away on all sides, and the summit is small enough that you can walk across it without tiring yourself out, but large enough to hold an entire planned community. In Wari times and in Tiwanaku times, this isolated mesa was not just a dramatic landmark. It was a shared frontier outpost, a place where people tied to both traditions lived, worked, and performed rituals on the same mountain for generations. The Moquegua Valley itself sits between worlds. To the north and inland, the highlands connect back toward Ayacucho and the Wari heartland. To the south and east, the land falls toward the Altiplano, toward Lake Titicaca and Tiwanaku. Climate and elevation shift over a short distance from coastal dryness to irrigated pockets of green. It is the sort of liminal space where different traditions might meet, trade, and test each other's presence. Cerro Baúl occupies one of the most defensible points in that landscape. The top is reached only by narrow ridges and steep pathways, and from the summit you can see far down the valley. It is no accident that Wari planners chose this spot. What is less intuitive is that people associated with Tiwanaku also claim space on the same plateau, and that the arrangement over time looks organized rather than chaotic. Archaeologists working on Cerro Baúl have mapped a dense pattern of architecture across the summit. When seen in plan, the layout divides into sectors. One cluster of compounds shows the rectilinear, orthogonal planning that has become familiar from Wari centres: enclosed patios, galleries of rooms around courtyards, walls meeting at sharp angles. Another cluster, closer to the narrow neck of the mountain that links the summit to neighbouring spurs, contains buildings and ritual spaces that align more closely with Tiwanaku-affiliated styles documented elsewhere in the Moquegua region. These differences are not simply a matter of taste. Construction techniques, wall foundations, room shapes, and artifact assemblages all help define distinct zones. In the Wari-identified precincts, you find the kinds of domestic and administrative layouts that echo Pikillacta and Viracochapampa in miniature: compounds with controlled entrances, storage spaces, and areas suited to gatherings. In the Tiwanaku-affiliated sectors, there are smaller ritual platforms, sunken spaces, and arrangements of buildings that recall Altiplano patterns brought downslope and adapted to the local topography. The separation between these zones is not marked by great walls or battle scars. Instead, it appears as an ordered patchwork. Here, a Wari compound. There, a Tiwanaku-linked ritual court. Between them, pathways and terraces that would have allowed movement back and forth. The impression, when the summit plan is laid out on paper, is of two architectural languages spoken side by side, each keeping its grammar but sharing the same page. Material culture reinforces this reading. In Wari precincts, ceramics in classic Wari styles dominate, with forms and designs at home in the Ayacucho sphere. In the Tiwanaku-related areas, local versions of Tiwanaku vessel shapes and iconography appear, echoing the Altiplano tradition rather than the Wari one. Yet the boundaries are permeable. Sherds with Wari motifs turn up in Tiwanaku-linked middens, and Tiwanaku-style pieces appear in Wari compounds, especially in contexts associated with drinking and serving. What is striking amid this mixture is the relative absence of unambiguous evidence for violent conflict between the communities on the mountain. Walls on Cerro Baúl certainly define and control space, but they do not show the repeated rebuilding, burn layers, and fortification races that would suggest an ongoing siege or cycles of assault. Human remains recovered from the site do not, as a rule, display the high frequencies of trauma that might indicate routine interpersonal violence or mass casualties from a single catastrophic attack. This does not mean that life on Cerro Baúl was serene in every respect. Frontier zones are often tense, and the very choice of such a defensible mountain implies an awareness of risk. But in the archaeological record, the long occupation of the summit by Wari and Tiwanaku affiliated groups looks structured and sustained. Generations passed with both traditions maintaining a presence on the same ridge, adjusting architecture, renewing buildings, and continuing ritual practices within sight and earshot of one another. The coexistence here feels different from the more diffuse connections suggested by Conchopata's ceramics. At Conchopata, Wari potters worked with Tiwanaku-related imagery at a distance, translating stone deities into painted figures on clay. On Cerro Baúl, people bringing Wari building practices and people linked to Tiwanaku ritual forms were literally neighbours. Their compounds shared retaining walls, their paths intersected. Their daily routines unfolded under the same sky. Scholars have described Cerro Baúl in various ways, as a Wari administrative enclave guarded on a frontier, as a pilgrimage and ritual node for Tiwanaku colonists in the Moquegua Valley, as a negotiated space where two regional powers managed a long border. The precise balance of these functions remains debated. What seems widely accepted is that both Wari and Tiwanaku-affiliated populations were present, that they maintained distinct identities in material terms, and that they did so without turning the mountain into a permanent battlefield. This alone makes Cerro Baúl one of the strangest and most concrete points of contact between the two traditions. Instead of an invisible line on a map, we have a single walkable summit where their architectures, their serving wares, and their ritual spaces touch. Instead of abstract models of interaction, we have doorways and patios where conversations might have taken place, feasts might have been shared, and decisions about coexistence might have been worked out face to face. The mountain in this sense becomes a kind of lived treaty. Its plan records an agreement, renewed over time, that different ways of building, worshipping and organizing life could occupy adjacent corners of the same narrow plateau. The details of that agreement, how it was struck, who enforced it, what tensions it contained are lost to us. What remains are the walls, the floors and the middens that show two powers choosing, for a while, to live side by side. As we move further into the story of Cerro Baúl, the calm layout of its zones will come into closer focus through the traces of everyday activity, the brewing of chicha, the staging of feasts, the final structured acts that marked the end of life on the summit. For now, it is enough to hold the image of that high, flat mountain, carrying on its back the weight of two intertwined histories. One of the most vivid traces of everyday life on Cerro Baúl is a set of rooms that, for a long time, were just lines on a plan. Rectangles of walls, doorways, hearths, middens only. When archaeologists began to look closely at the residues left on the floors, at the shapes of the vessels, at the arrangement of spaces, did the pattern come into focus. This was not just another compound, it was a brewery. In Wari society, brewing chicha, corn beer, sometimes mixed with other plants, was not a trivial household task. It was a specialized craft tied to status and ceremony. The Cerro Baúl brewery fits this pattern. Its rooms form a sequence that takes raw grain and turns it, step by step, into a drink intended for large gatherings. Near one edge of the complex shallow pits and grinding stones suggest areas where women, probably elite craft specialists, soaked and malted maize, letting it sprout just enough to release sugars. Nearby, rows of grinding stones are worn down from repeated use, the kind of wear that comes from many hands processing grain over decades. In adjacent rooms, large hearths and fire-reddened floors mark the places where the mash was boiled. In still other spaces, archaeologists found the broken remains of great ceramic vats, some capable of holding dozens of litres at a time, their interiors stained by the chemical traces of fermented beverages. This is industrial-scale production by pre-industrial standards. When researchers calculate the total volume of the vats and the likely capacity of the complex, they arrive at figures suggesting that a single brewing episode could have produced chicha for hundreds of drinkers. Not just a family, not even a single neighbourhood, a crowd. The Cerro Baúl brewery sits firmly within the Wari architectural zone of the summit. Its walls follow the same orthogonal order as nearby administrative compounds. Access is controlled by narrow doorways and internal partitions that guide movement. Storage areas hold evidence of stacked vessels and raw materials. Yet when you look at the broken serving cups and jars scattered in and around the complex, the picture widens beyond a purely Wari story. Many of the serving vessels are in classic Wari styles, tall beakers with painted motifs, some echoing the imagery seen at Conchopata and other heartland sites. Others, however, pick up forms and designs more familiar from Tiwanaku-linked assemblages in the Moquegua Valley and the Altiplano. Flared rims, certain geometric patterns, local imitations of Tiwanaku shapes rendered in Wari clays and slips. The brewery, while Wari in plan, was not serving only one material tradition. In the Andes of the first millennium, chicha was more than a drink. It was a medium for relationships. Hosts used it to welcome visitors, to honour ancestors, to cement agreements, to mark festivals tied to agricultural cycles and state calendars. Feasting was a form of diplomacy. To invite someone to drink in your compound, from cups you provided, was to acknowledge a relationship and, in some sense, to stage that relationship in public. On Cerro Baúl, the brewery seems to have been closely connected to open spaces suitable for gatherings. Courtyards and plazas near the complex show dense scatters of broken serving vessels, food remains and other debris consistent with repeated episodes of large-scale feasting. Botanical remains indicate not only maize, but a range of foods that would have required coordination to assemble: tubers, possibly meat from camelids driven up from the valley or brought from nearby herding areas, perhaps even dried products moved along caravan networks. The scale of this debris, the density of broken cups, and the repeated resurfacing of floors all point in the same direction. Feasts here were not one-time events. They were part of a recurring cycle, perhaps tied to Wari administrative visits, agricultural milestones, or moments when relations with Tiwanaku-linked communities on and around the mountain needed to be reaffirmed. In this light, the coexistence described earlier, the patchwork of Wari compounds and Tiwanaku-affiliated ritual spaces, takes on a more textured character. It is not just shared space, it is shared cups, shared intoxication, shared time spent together in altered states of mind. When participants from both traditions sat in the same courtyard, drank from vessels painted in different styles, and listened to the same toasts or ritual speeches, they were, for a few hours at least, part of a single social event. Chicha feasting in many Andean contexts carries layered meanings. It can express hierarchy, with hosts demonstrating their power by providing abundant drink and food, seating guests according to rank, and orchestrating the order of toasts. It can also signal alliance, as groups drink together to seal agreements, resolve disputes, or acknowledge mutual obligations. The brewery on Cerro Baúl seems to have been a tool for both. From one perspective, it embodies Wari power, a carefully planned facility staffed by specialized brewers capable of producing impressive quantities of drink on demand. In this reading, the brewery allowed Wari officials to host Tiwanaku-linked neighbours, valley farmers, and local leaders in a setting that showcased Wari organisational capacity. The rectangular courtyards, the standardised cups, the ordered circulation of drink could be seen as a kind of soft projection of Wari authority. From another perspective, the very presence of Tiwanaku-style vessels in the feasting debris, at the proximity of Tiwanaku-affiliated ritual spaces on the same summit, suggests that these events were not one-sided demonstrations of dominance. They may have been negotiated performances with protocols understood by both sides. Tiwanaku-linked participants might have brought their own vessels, their own drinking customs, or their own ritual specialists into the mix. Feasts could have been occasions when the lived treaty of the mountain was renewed, not just through words, but through shared intoxication and shared narratives. Archaeologists sometimes talk about feasts as moments when social contracts become visible. On Cerro Baúl, the contract between Wari and Tiwanaku-affiliated populations is hard to reconstruct in detail, but its outlines appear in the brewery's layout and the trash it left behind. Regular, large-scale production implies regular gatherings. The mixed ceramic assemblage implies overlapping guest lists. The continuity of occupation over generations implies that, whatever tensions existed, the system worked well enough to be sustained. It is worth remembering that Wari is conventionally described as an empire in scholarly literature, with administrative centres and planned colonies, while Tiwanaku's status is more contested, ranging from views of an expansionist state to interpretations of a hegemonic ritual or colonial network. On Cerro Baúl, those broad models meet in very human ways. An imperial-style brewery built to serve a planned enclave operates on a frontier where ritual hegemony and political negotiation intersect over shared drinks. The chemistry of chicha also plays a quiet role in this story. Alcohol lowers inhibitions, creates a sense of warmth and camaraderie, and when used in ritualized settings, can foster feelings of solidarity that last beyond the event itself. Elite hosts across the Andes seem to have been very aware of this and used it carefully. On the mountain, controlled inebriation might have helped soften hard conversations about land, water, and ritual precedents. It might have helped cement marriages or foster adoptive kin ties across cultural lines. At the same time, there are hints that not everyone on Cerro Baúl experienced these feasts in the same way. The arrangement of compounds suggests that some areas were reserved for higher status guests, others for more ordinary participants. Certain decorated beakers are concentrated in particular sectors, while plainer cups appear more widely. Even within a shared event, distinctions were maintained, subtle reminders of hierarchy and difference amid the appearance of unity. Over centuries, the brewery would have become woven into the rhythm of life on the summit. Its fires would have been lit in anticipation of visits. Its vats would have been scrubbed and repaired. Recipes and brewing knowledge would have been passed down through generations of specialist workers, some perhaps descended from families in the Wari heartland, others drawn from local communities who came to understand the expectations and schedules of the enclave. All of this makes the eventual end of the brewery and of feasting on the summit feel especially poignant. A facility so carefully built, so central to the social life of the mountain, does not simply fade without leaving marks. The way it was shut down, and the traces that shut down left in ash and broken pottery, form one of the clearest windows we have into the deliberate closing of a chapter in Wari and Tiwanaku-linked interaction. When archaeologists reached the final layers of the brewery, they did not find the pattern one would expect from a raid or a sudden, panicked flight. There were no scattered weapons, no bodies left where they fell, no doors barred from the inside. Instead, they found something slower, more deliberate, preserved in ash and carefully broken things. In the main brewing rooms, the great ceramic vats were not simply toppled by collapsing roofs. Many of them had been fractured in place, pieces still resting where they fell, as if someone had struck them again and again until they were unusable, then left the fragments where they lay. Some sherds were stacked or leaned together in ways that do not fit the chaos of battle. They fit something else, an orderly decommissioning. On the floors, archaeologists traced layers of burning that were too regular to be accidental. Fire licked up walls and across roofs. But the pattern of charring suggests that fuel was added intentionally, that fires were set in key spots and allowed to run their course. In several rooms, beams seemed to have been propped or arranged, so that once they burned through, roofs would fall inward, sealing the space under a blanket of ash and debris. Within that ash, they found offerings, not many, and not randomly scattered. In some places, clusters of fine serving vessels had been laid down, then smashed, then burned. In others, prized objects, decorated beakers, or unusually large jars were placed on floors that show no sign of everyday wear in their final use phases, as if the rooms had been cleaned before these last acts took place. The botanical remains tell a similar story of ceremony rather than disaster. There was not much charred maize stored away in corners, no great heaps of grain caught by surprise. Instead, there are traces of a final brewing episode, malted kernels, residues on vessel interiors, chemical signatures consistent with chicha that had been prepared and consumed shortly before the fire. It seems the brewery was used one last time at full capacity and then closed. Excavators have suggested that this last use might have been a farewell feast. The density of broken serving vessels in adjacent courtyards, all from the same final burning horizon, points toward an unusually large gathering. Beakers in classic Wari styles lie side by side with pieces in local and Tiwanaku-linked forms as they had during ordinary feasts, but now they are smashed more comprehensively, left in thick carpets on the ground, then sealed under collapsed walls and roofing. In some Andean traditions recorded long after the time of Cerro Baúl, important buildings were not abandoned casually. They were killed in orderly ways, walls ritually breached, offerings placed at thresholds, roofs burned to release the structure's vitality. The brewery's end echoes this pattern. Hearths seem to have been cleaned out, then deliberately filled with selected debris. Doorways show concentrations of sherds and ash that suggest attention to thresholds, as if people paused there to make final gestures before leaving. Animal remains add another quiet layer. In the last levels, bones of camelids and other food animals are present, but skewed toward parts associated with feasting, meat-rich limbs, selected cuts, not the mixed butchery debris of daily meals. Some bones show cut marks, others signs of having been roasted, and many are found in the same burned layers as the shattered cups. This looks less like people fleeing a fire, and more like people eating, drinking, performing a closing event, and then walking away. Importantly, there is very little evidence for defensive measures taken immediately before the burning. Fortification walls on the summit were already in place as part of the long-term layout, but within the brewery and neighbouring compounds there are no hasty repairs or makeshift barricades that would signal an impending attack. Tools and everyday objects are not strewn about as if dropped mid-task. Storage spaces appear to have been emptied in an orderly way. It seems that when the brewery burned, its owners had time to prepare. Scholars who work on Cerro Baúl emphasize that this pattern looks intentional, a planned, ceremonial termination of Wari occupation on the summit, rather than the residue of sudden conquest. The fire is destructive, but it is structured destruction. Everything about it, from the sequence of final activity to the way the flames were allowed to consume and seal the building suggests that those who lit the fires expected not to return. The presence of Tiwanaku style and local vessels in the final deposits suggests that this was not a purely internal Wari act. Guests from surrounding communities, and perhaps from Tiwanaku-affiliated groups on the mountain and in the valley, may have participated in, or at least witnessed, the last great feast. If so, the ending of the brewery was also the ending of a shared institution, one that had mediated relations across cultural lines for generations. Different interpretations exist. Some researchers see the ritual burning as an orderly withdrawal in the face of broader instability, a way for Wari officials to close their enclave with dignity as political or environmental pressures mounted. Others emphasize the possibility that local groups, including Tiwanaku-linked communities, may have taken a leading role in deciding how the site should be closed, transforming an imperial-style facility into a setting for collective ritual one last time. The evidence does not fix a single reading, but it consistently supports the idea of planning and ceremony rather than abrupt collapse. What is clear is that, after the fires, the brewery was not rebuilt. The ash settled. The broken vats remained where they fell. Later visitors moved through a landscape of charred walls and melted plaster, not through a functioning industrial complex. The feasting courtyards filled with wind-blown dust instead of footprints and spilled drink. With the burning of the brewery, the social engine that had sustained shared occupation on Cerro Baúl came to a formal end. The place where Wari administrators, Tiwanaku-affiliated ritual specialists, and local farmers had gathered to drink from differently painted cups under the same sky was closed with care and then left behind. The mountain was still there, the ridges unchanged, but the particular way Wari and Tiwanaku-linked worlds had met on that summit had been brought, quite deliberately, to a close. When we pull back from Cerro Baúl and look at the wider Andean world, the careful ending of one brewery on one summit falls into a broader pattern, across the high plateau to the south, around Lake Titicaca, and across the highlands to the north and west. Centres that had been active for centuries begin to thin out, quiet down, and in many cases fall silent in the span of a few generations. Archaeologists do not have a single year, or even a single decade, to point to. Instead, they work with a window. For Tiwanaku, the great ritual and political centre on the southern shores of Lake Titicaca, the decline seems to begin in the late 900s and unfold across the 11th century. Monumental spaces that had been carefully maintained start to show signs of neglect. Drainage canals clog. Walls are repaired less often, then not at all. Offerings in temples grow sparser and, eventually, stop. In the Wari heartland, around modern Ayacucho, the story is also one of gradual unwinding. The gridded compounds of the Wari capital, so dense with evidence of craft production and administration in earlier centuries, show fewer building episodes over time. Certain sectors go out of use while others are still active. Long-distance goods appear in lower quantities. By the time we reach the 11th century, much of the capital seems to have been abandoned, with activity retreating to smaller pockets. When researchers line up the radiocarbon dates, look at ceramic sequences, and trace the last intensive use of major buildings, a rough pattern emerges. In both regions, the summit period of state power and large-scale integration peaks somewhere between about 750 and 950 AD. After that, the graphs slope downward. By about 1000 to 1100, both Tiwanaku and Wari are shadows of what they had been. The details differ. Tiwanaku's core temples and sunken courts linger in use longer than some outlying sites. Wari centres in different valleys show slightly staggered endings. Some frontier installations like Cerro Baúl extend the story into the 11th century, even as the heartland changes. But the overall impression is clear enough that archaeologists talk about a shared collapse window for these two powers, a broad span of years around the turn of the millennium when both systems lose coherence. This shared timing is striking because the two states were not organized in the same way. In the literature, Wari is commonly described as an empire, with a centralized administration, planned provincial centers, and a network of roads and storage facilities that tied outlying regions to a core in the Ayacucho highlands. Tiwanaku, by contrast, sits at the center of an ongoing debate. Some researchers, like John Kollu, argue for an expansionist state that directly controlled wide areas of the Altiplano, while others see a hegemonic ritual center and colonial network based more on pilgrimage, ideology and enclaves than on tightly administered provinces. Yet, despite these structural differences, the archaeological signals of waning power overlap in time. In Tiwanaku's sphere, the raised field agriculture that had once supported high population densities around the lake shows signs of disuse. Fields are left fallow, canals silt in, and the intensive management of water that had characterized the mature Tiwanaku system appears to slacken. In Wari territory, large planned compounds like Pikillacta show abrupt cessation of building programs, unfinished projects, and final use levels that belong in the same general centuries. The ceramic evidence tells a similar story. Both traditions have well-studied styles that allow archaeologists to place assemblages in relative order. Late Tiwanaku pottery, with its specific motifs and vessel forms, becomes rarer after about 1000 AD, replaced by more localized styles. Late Wari ceramics, once widely distributed across the central highlands and coast, also contract. In both cases, the distinctive state-linked iconography that had moved along long-distance networks is replaced by more regional, less standardized decoration. Importantly, there is no single smoking gun layer that runs across the whole mountain range. Some sites show traces of burning, others do not. Some centers were closed ritually, as at Cerro Baúl. Others appear to have emptied more gradually, their walls slowly dismantled, their courtyards filled by erosion rather than flames. The shared collapse window is not a single dramatic moment, but a cluster of local endings that, when viewed from a distance, line up in time. For historians and archaeologists, this simultaneity is unusual. In many parts of the world, one large polity's decline creates opportunities for another's expansion. Gaps open, neighbours move in. In the central Andes, around 1000 to 1000 NAD, something else seems to be happening. Two large, largely independent powers, each with its own history, its own administrative solutions, its own ritual traditions and economic bases, both falter in the same broad period. They were not mirror images. Tiwanaku's authority flowed outward from a single, heavily sacralized landscape around the lake, anchored in long-term manipulation of water and soil and in pilgrimage to monumental spaces. Wari's power spread through replicated layouts on distant hilltops and valley margins, with administrators living inside orthogonal compounds that echoed the capital's plan. Their routes of expansion and their ways of projecting influence were different enough that one might expect their lifespans to be offset, not aligned. This makes the shared collapse window a puzzle. It suggests that, alongside local histories and internal dynamics, there were broader conditions affecting both halves of the southern highlands. Conditions that could reach across hundreds of kilometers of rugged terrain, across different language groups and economic systems, and still set a rough boundary on how long these states could endure. Scholars have put forward a wide range of explanations. Some point to climate. Ice cores from high Andean glaciers and lake sediment records hint at shifts in rainfall around this time, with suggestions of prolonged droughts interrupting the high-altitude hydrological regimes that Tiwanaku's fields and Wari's terrace systems depended on. In this view, The shared window is the signature of a regional environmental crisis that strained both states' agricultural foundations. Others focus on internal social change. They suggest that long-standing tensions within each system between core and periphery, between administrators and local communities, between ritual obligations and everyday subsistence, may have built up over generations. Under this reading, the 11th century is the moment when local groups chose to step away from participation in large-scale projects, allowing fields, roads, and compounds to fall out of use. Still others consider shifting trade routes and the rise of alternative regional centres. As the flow of goods and people through Wari and Tiwanaku hubs weakened, new nodes may have emerged in other valleys and basins, offering different political arrangements that drew loyalty away from older capitals. Epidemics, warfare, and ideological change have also been suggested, though the material record for these remains fragmentary and regionally varied. None of these explanations has been accepted as definitive, in part because the evidence itself is patchy and anchored to particular sites. Some regions show strong indications of environmental stress. Others look more like cases of deliberate reorganization. The shared collapse window is robust as a broad pattern, but the mechanisms inside it are still a matter of active research and gentle disagreement. For our purposes, it forms a quiet frame. Around 1000 to 1100 AD, the brewery on Cerro Baúl is closed with ceremony. Pikillacta's compounds are left unfinished. Viracochapampa's great plaza sees its last gatherings. In the Titicaca Basin, the flows of water through Tiwanaku's raised fields no longer match the massive investment of earlier centuries. Across the Altiplano and highlands, people are reconfiguring their lives in ways that no longer require the same kinds of centralized projects. In the next part of this story, we will sit with one line of evidence that has shaped many modern discussions: the record of ice and dust preserved in the Quelccaya ice cap, high above the Altiplano. From that frozen core, some researchers see the faint outline of a drought, stretching across the same centuries as the decline of Tiwanaku and Wari. Others read the ice differently. Like the ruins on the mountain ridge, the ice offers clues, but not a final answer. High on the eastern edge of the Altiplano, above the tree line and above most human footprints, sits a broad white dome of ice called Quelccaya. From a distance, it looks timeless, almost outside of history. But inside that mass of snow and frozen meltwater, time is stacked in thin, compressed sheets. Each year, storms sweep in from the Amazon side, dropping snow across the ice cap. In the dry season, fine dust and volcanic ash drift down from far away. Over centuries, the layers build. Snow compresses into firn, then into glacial ice, trapping tiny bubbles of air, traces of pollen, dust, and subtle shifts in chemistry that register the changing balance of temperature and moisture in the atmosphere. When glaciologists drill down through Quelccaya, they are not just pulling up frozen water. They are sampling a timeline. The deeper the core segment, the older the year it represents. Bands of lighter and darker ice, thin dust-rich layers, and shifts in the ratio of oxygen isotopes become a record of wet years and dry years, warm phases and cool ones, storms and calms, stretching back more than a millennium. In the late 20th century, when teams led by Lonnie Thompson and others extracted long ice cores from Quelccaya, they were hoping to read broad patterns in tropical climate history. What they found has become one of the central pieces of evidence in discussions of Tiwanaku and Wari's decline. When researchers measured the chemistry and physical properties of the ice, a pattern began to emerge. For long stretches, the record suggested relatively stable conditions, a dependable alternation of wet and dry seasons, with snowfall on the ice cap reflecting the wider circulation of moisture across the highlands. Then, around the late first millennium AD, something appears to shift. In some reconstructions, A period beginning in the 9th century and extending into the 11th shows signals consistent with reduced precipitation. Layers that should indicate heavy wet season snowfalls appear thinner. Dust concentrations increase in some intervals, hinting at drier surfaces around the ice cap and across the plateau. The oxygen isotope values, which respond to temperature and moisture sources, also change in ways that many interpret as a move toward cooler, drier conditions at high altitude. This is not a sudden spike, like a single catastrophic storm or eruption. It looks more like a drawn-out lean season written across generations, a clustering of drier years interrupted by brief respites that would have made water management on the Altiplano more challenging. When those climate curves are laid next to archaeological chronologies, the overlap is striking. The period when Tiwanaku's raised fields begin to fall out of use, and when Wari centres show their last major occupation, lines up broadly with the most pronounced part of the drier interval in the ice. From there, it is not hard to sketch a scenario. The Suka Kollu fields around Lake Titicaca, with their raised planting platforms and intervening canals, were exquisitely tuned to the local hydrology. They trapped heat, moderated frost, and stored water. Under normal conditions, they seem to have been able to buffer communities against short-term fluctuations in rainfall. But even a resilient system has limits. Imagine a series of years in which the rains arrive late, or end early, or fall unevenly, concentrating in a few downpours instead of soaking the basin over months. Canals that once held a constant sheet of water might shrink to muddy traces. The thin layer of floodwater that protected seedlings from night frost might grow patchy. The careful balance between water, soil, and temperature that made the fields so productive could begin to fray. Over decades, farmers might respond in many ways. They could abandon the most marginal plots and concentrate labour on the most reliable zones. They could diversify crops, adjust planting dates, or extend irrigation ditches from springs and streams to supplement erratic rainfall. All of these strategies leave traces in the landscape, but those traces are hard to date with precision. From the perspective of the ice, though, the pressure would be the same, a background of reduced moisture that forced constant adjustment. In Wari territory, highland agriculture depended more on terraces and canal-fed fields along valley slopes. These too were built to handle variation, capturing runoff and soil that might otherwise be lost downslope. Under a prolonged pattern of drier years, however, the flow in headwater streams could fall, making it harder to keep the full suite of terraces watered. Lower fields might continue in use while upper ones went fallow. The labour required to maintain stone walls, canals, and distribution structures might outstrip the benefits for communities already stretched thin. In this light, the Quelccaya record offers a quiet but powerful framework. It suggests that the shared collapse window was not unfolding against a backdrop of climatic normalcy, but during a time when the sky itself was shifting its patterns, lowering the margin for error in systems that depended on coordinated labour and careful management of high-altitude water. At the same time, scholars are careful not to let the ice dictate the entire story. Ice cores are complex archives. Their annual layers can be hard to count in older sections. Dating uncertainties grow as one moves deeper. Chemical signatures can be influenced by multiple factors, not just rainfall. Changes in storm tracks, temperature, and distant volcanic eruptions can all leave similar marks. Different extraction sites on the same ice cap can yield slightly different sequences, and reconciling them requires interpretation. There are also spatial questions. Quelccaya sits in a particular corner of the Andes, influenced by specific moisture sources. Its record is regional but not global. Conditions over the Titicaca Basin, the Wari heartland, and more distant valleys may not have matched it exactly. Lake sediments, tree rings, and other proxy records from elsewhere in the central Andes sometimes support the picture of a drier interval, In other cases, they show more localized behavior. The climate backdrop was probably patchy, with some basins feeling the stress more acutely than others. For these reasons, many archaeologists treat the drought hypothesis as an important context rather than a single explanatory key. A prolonged period of reduced rainfall could have strained agricultural systems, sharpened existing inequalities, and made political promises harder to fulfill. It could have undermined the ability of Tiwanaku leaders to guarantee abundance through ritual and water control. And it could have challenged Wari administrators who relied on surplus to fund feasts, craft production, and military obligations. But those stresses would have played out through the particular social and political arrangements of each region. The same sequence of dry years might lead to one community reorganizing its fields and leadership, another intensifying certain rituals, and a third deciding to withdraw labour from distant state projects and invest instead in local autonomy. In the end, the Quelccaya ice core offers a cool, distant perspective. It tells us that, during the centuries when Tiwanaku and Wari were unwinding, the high atmosphere above the Andes was carrying less moisture to some summits. It hints that the shared collapse window unfolded under a sky that was less generous with rain and snow. It does not, on its own, tell us why particular breweries were closed with ceremony, why certain plazas were left unfinished, or why people chose new settlement patterns in the aftermath. For that we have to look at the human side of the story, the ways communities adapted, fragmented, and reimagined their worlds in response to changing conditions that were environmental, social, and political all at once. The drought theory, then, remains one thread among several. It is compelling, and it fits well with the layered evidence from the ice and from some landscapes. But it sits alongside other explanations, not above them. The Altiplano and the highlands did not empty simply because less snow fell on Quelccaya. They changed because people living under that altered sky made choices, gradual, local, and diverse, that carried Tiwanaku and Wari into their final phases. When scholars turn from the sky back to the ground, another pattern comes into view. It is quieter than drought and harder to render as a single curve on a chart. It shows up instead as a gradual thinning of connections, a loosening of cords that had once tied distant places together. For Tiwanaku, this is often framed as a loss of central coordination. In earlier centuries, the raised fields, satellite villages, pilgrimage routes, and ritual centres around Lake Titicaca seemed to pulse in step. Ceramic styles, iconography, and construction practices link out from the monumental core-like ripples from a stone dropped in water. Colonies in the Moquegua Valley, on the coast, and in other highland basins show similar patterns of pottery and ritual, suggesting they were tied into a shared system of authority and belief. By the 10th and 11th centuries, that pattern changes. Some outlying settlements show continued occupation, but with altered material culture. Pottery styles become more localized, imported prestige goods arrive in smaller quantities, or stop arriving altogether. Architectural projects at the core appear to halt. The great platforms and sunken courts receive less maintenance. There are signs of reuse, of small-scale domestic activities in spaces that had once been strictly ceremonial. Some researchers interpret this as a sign that central leaders in Tiwanaku had lost the ability or the perceived legitimacy to organize large-scale labor. In this view, local communities began to shift their energy inward, focusing on household fields and nearby shrines rather than distant state projects. The network did not vanish overnight. It unravelled strand by strand, as obligations were renegotiated and promises of abundance became harder to fulfill under environmental stress. A similar story has been proposed for Wari, which most archaeologists are comfortable calling an empire, in contrast to Tiwanaku, whose status oscillates in the literature between expansionist state in Colata's sense and a looser hegemonic ritual or colonial network in other interpretations. In the Wari heartland, administrative centres like Pikillacta and Viracochapampa show a clear rise, fluorescence and decline in the span of a few centuries. Their early phases are marked by rigorous planning, standardized architecture and storage facilities that speak to centralized control over surplus. Later the picture shifts. Some Wari compounds show signs of subdivision, with walls built inside older, more open spaces. Storage rooms fall out of use or are repurposed. Peripheral installations are abandoned while others persist in reduced form. In some valleys, local elites appear to continue using Wari-style objects and buildings, but without the same strong tie to a distant capital. The visual language of power lingers, but the administrative machinery behind it hums more quietly, then falls silent. In this framework, drought is not the sole actor, but an amplifying background. As water becomes less predictable, the task of promising stability grows more difficult. Leaders who had once orchestrated terrace maintenance, canal cleaning, and surplus redistribution in return for labour and allegiance might find their position less secure. If harvests are disappointing despite ritual and coordination, communities may start to question the value of participation in wide-ranging state projects. Local leaders might step forward offering more immediate solutions, or simply urging a return to older, smaller-scale ways of organizing work and worship. This is the essence of the fragmentation hypothesis. It suggests that both Tiwanaku and Wari did not so much fall as dissolve, their large-scale integrative structures giving way to a mosaic of smaller polities and community networks. Some of these may have drawn directly on the institutions and symbols of the old regimes. Others may have rejected them, or simply let them fade as generations passed. Set against the climate drought explanation, fragmentation offers a complementary, not a competing lens. Agricultural shortfalls and erratic rainfall could have been the pressures that pushed people to reconsider existing arrangements. At the same time, long-standing internal tensions between core and periphery, between ritual specialists and farmers, between hereditary elites and rising local figures, may have shaped how those pressures were experienced. In some places, cooperation might have deepened. In others, alliances might have frayed. What is striking, though, is what the evidence does not show. Across the Tiwanaku heartland, there are no clear signs of large-scale burning or fortifications overwhelmed by hostile forces dating specifically to the period of decline. Weapons and trauma patterns on human remains do not point to a single decisive conquest by an outside group sweeping over the Altiplano and dismantling the city. In Wari territory, the picture is similar. Sites like Pikillacta show orderly abandonment more than violent destruction. Walls are not uniformly smashed, bodies are not scattered in massacre layers associated with the final phases. Some compounds appear to have been closed deliberately, entrances blocked, objects cached or removed. This looks less like a sudden overthrow and more like a drawn-out disengagement. Nor do we see a single catastrophic event stamped clearly into the archaeological record. No widespread ash layer linked to a known eruption that coincides exactly with the shared collapse window. No continent-spanning earthquake scar. No unmistakable sign of pandemics that sweep through multiple regions at once and leave consistent, datable traces. Local disasters certainly occurred. They always do in mountainous landscapes, but there is no smoking gun that can be pointed to as the one blow that felled both systems. Instead, after the 11th century, the record becomes patchier. In both the Titicaca Basin and the Central Highlands, monumental projects become rarer. Some hilltops show new forms of fortified settlement, but these tend to belong to later cultural traditions. Pottery assemblages shift toward more regional styles. Textiles and ritual objects lose the standardized motifs that had once linked distant zones, into shared iconographic programs. For historians used to written chronicles, this can feel like a kind of silence. There are no contemporary texts to narrate these centuries of reorganization. Later Andean oral traditions, eventually written down under very different political circumstances, remember ancient places and peoples, but do not preserve a clear, continuous story that we can tie directly to Tiwanaku and Wari's last generations. From the vantage point of the 11th or 12th century, a traveller crossing the same mountain ranges that had once anchored two expansive systems would have encountered a more fragmented landscape. Local lordships, farming communities, regional cults, each with their own histories. Some threads from the Tiwanaku and Wari eras were surely still there, in languages, in myths, in farming techniques and sacred geographies, but they are hard to isolate in the material record. By the time later highland polities began to weave new large-scale structures across the Andes, the old empires of the Altiplano and the central valleys were already ruins and memories. Their disappearance had left space and time for other experiments in organization to take root. In the end, when we try to say why Tiwanaku and Wari unwound, we are left balancing partial stories. Prolonged shifts in rainfall, documented in ice and sediments, gradual loss of central coordination, seen in abandoned fields, repurposed compounds and localized styles, internal tensions that we can infer but not hear directly. What we can say with some confidence is that there was no single conqueror, no one calamity that toppled both at once. What remains is a long, quiet interval in the highlands, during which people adapted to new conditions, drew on older legacies, and prepared unknowingly for futures that would be built over the same ridges, valleys, and lakes. The cause of that twin decline, shared across a mountain range, stays open. It sits somewhere in the interplay between environment and choice, between water in the sky and decisions on the ground, between remembered obligations and the slow generational work of letting them go. So we end where we began, with a long backbone of stone running through South America, and with two different powers fading out along its heights within the same loose window of time. To the south, Tiwanaku and the Altiplano, with their sunken courts, raised fields, and contested status somewhere between empire, pilgrimage centre, and expansive ritual network. To the north, Wari in the central highlands, a political structure most archaeologists are comfortable calling an empire, with rectilinear compounds, planned cities, and administrative storehouses. Both rose on that same Andean spine, both reached out across valleys and coasts, weaving together communities that had once been more isolated. Both left behind distinctive architectures and visual languages that you can still trace in broken walls and fragments of pottery. And then across the 10th and 11th centuries, both recede from the record. Building slows, great projects halt. Regional styles take the place of wide-spanning ones. We can line up ice cores and sediment records and see evidence for long episodes of reduced rainfall. We can walk through abandoned compounds and see signs of reorganization, of authority thinning out, of regionalization. We can propose models in which climate stress, political fragmentation, and local choices all interact. But no single cause is agreed upon. There is no consensus moment when everyone in the field nods and says, yes, that was it. Instead, Tiwanaku and Wari remain as open questions stretched across a mountain range. Their endings look less like sudden falls and more like long, uneven transitions, different in each valley, each community. For now, that is where the evidence leaves us, with parallel stories of rise and retreat, linked in time and space, but not resolved into a single neat explanation. If you've been listening while you drift towards sleep, you can just let that uncertainty sit, like distant peaks you can sense but not see clearly in the dark, knowing that not every past has to be fully explained for us, to rest inside it for a while. If you'd like to help more people find these quiet histories, you can gently tap like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment. I always enjoy reading where people are listening from, so if you feel like it, you can share your city, your region, or just the kind of landscape outside your window. If you prefer audio, or you want to support this work in the simplest way, the best thing you can do is listen on Spotify. There's a link in the description. Putting these episodes on there, even in the background, helps the channel grow in a calm, steady way. For now, the mountains stay where they are. The old walls of Tiwanaku and the quiet compounds of Wari remain under the same thin air, holding their own reasons close. The questions will still be there tomorrow. You can set them down for the night, and let the Andes fade into the background as you fall asleep.